My older brother was dying in a hospital room when his son caught my arm and whispered, "Whatever papers your son brings tomorrow, don't sign them." His face was ashen after 7 hours on the road. He needs to wrap everything up before Monday. He's desperate enough to try anything. When I walked back in, my son stood at the bedside in a pressed navy suit leather briefcase in hand, smiling like he'd already won. Welcome back to His Hidden Revenge, where the stories that stay with you longest are the ones closest to real life. If what you hear today moves you, I'd be grateful if you stayed with us and hit subscribe. It means more than you know. One quick thing before we begin. Are you listening through headphones right now, or letting it fill a room through a speaker? There's something about a story this heavy that changes depending on how close it sits to you. A note before we go any further. Some details in this story have been shaped for the purposes of audio storytelling, and any resemblance to specific real individuals or events is purely coincidental. It's the truth underneath the story that matters here. That's very real. The phone rang at 11:47 p.m. on October the 30th, and I knew before I picked up that my brother was dying. Not the way you sense a storm rolling in or anticipate a traffic jam. The way you know a shipping container's about to go over when the crane operator miscalculated the load. Certain, mechanical, inevitable. I was standing in my Albuquerque kitchen with a mug of tea halfway to my lips when the ringtone shattered the quiet. The hospice center's name lit up the screen, Pinon Ridge, Santa Fe. Mr. Halver. The nurse's voice carried that professionally calibrated gentleness, the kind that doesn't come cheap in training hours. Your brother asked for you by name. He's been calling for you all evening. I set the mug down on the tile counter with care, watching the condensation, trace lines down the side. At 63, I'd spent close to 4 decades routing freight across the Southwest, a trade that taught me to trust paper over people and read fine print like a second language. I knew how to plot drive time fuel windows arrival estimates. Santa Fe was 11 hours north. "I'm leaving now," I said. 20 minutes later, I was on Interstate 25 with a go bag, a full tank, and the suffocating knowledge that I was driving toward a last goodbye. I wasn't prepared to say it out loud. Doan Holver, 67, pancreatic cancer. My older brother, the steady presence who'd raised me after our father left in 1969, had maybe 48 hours, maybe fewer. The nurse had told me he'd been agitated, calling my name like a prayer or a warning. Somewhere around El Paso, I left a voicemail for my son. "Your uncle's in hospice up in Santa Fe. I'm on the road now. I'll call when I get there." The desert night swallowed the headlights whole. I drove through Flagstaff, through the painted darkness of northern Texas, past rest stops and gas stations reeking of diesel and burnt coffee. Somewhere past the Colorado state line, the grief shifted into something harder and sharper. Doan wasn't only dying, he was waiting. The urgency threading through that nurse's voice hadn't been about medical decline. It had been about fear, his fear, the kind that makes a dying man fight the morphine to stay conscious. I'd spent 37 years trusting freight manifests and shipping schedules over people, and I was about to learn that had been a catastrophic mistake. By the time I pulled into Santa Fe, dawn was breaking cold and gray over the valley. Pinon Ridge Hospice Center perched on a hill above the city, a low building designed to look comforting and failing at it. A dozen cars dotted the parking lot. I recognized none of them. Inside, the air carried cedar oil, masking something clinical and final. A receptionist with kind eyes directed me to room 314, third floor east wing. The elevator climbed too slowly. My reflection in the metal doors looked older than 63, looked like a man who'd driven through the night chasing something he couldn't name. The door to 314 stood half open. Doan lay in the adjustable bed, skeletal beneath white sheets, maybe 90 pounds left. Of the man who'd once hoisted me onto his shoulders at county fairs and little league games. An oxygen cannula crossed his face. His breathing rattled like gravel in a tin can, and there beside the bed, wearing a pressed navy suit that cost more than he could afford, stood my son, Brixton Halver. The 39-year-old insurance adjuster smiled when he saw me. His professional smile, the one he deployed to close deals and sidestep questions perfectly tuned to project concern, while hiding the desperation I'd come to recognize whenever he called looking for a loan. "Dad," he said, stepping forward to grip my shoulder. "You made good time. I got here last night. Didn't want Uncle Doan to be alone." Something cold settled in my chest. Last night, Brixton had driven up from Albuquerque a full 12 hours before I'd even received the call. How had he known? Don't, I said, moving past Brixton to the bedside. My brother's eyes opened blue-raw, terrified. His hands shot out with startling force and locked around my wrist. His lips shaped words that barely made it out. Don't let him. Then the grip went slack. The morphine pulled him back under. He's been like that all night, Brixton said softly, standing too close behind me. The nurse says it's the medication. Makes him confused. A woman in purple scrubs filled the doorway. 40-something dark hair pulled back name badge that read Tegan Morrow R.N. She'd been doing this work long enough to know when a family member's presence brought fear instead of comfort. I could see it in the way her eyes moved from Doan to Brixton and back to me. Mr. Halver, she said, addressing me directly. He's been asking for you since midnight. He seems worried about something, worried about dying. Brixton said, his tone warm and absolutely certain. That's normal, isn't it? The fear at the end. Tegan's expression held steady, but something behind her eyes sharpened. Sometimes fear, sometimes they're trying to tell us something important. I looked down at Doan's hand, the one that had seized my wrist. His fingers were still curled as though he hadn't let go. Then I noticed the leather briefcase. It sat on the chair beside the bed. Expensive brown leather, Brix's initials embossed in gold on the flap. The kind you bring to a client meeting, not a deathbed vigil. What kind of son arrives 12 hours early to a dying man's room unless he needed time alone with that man and a pen? Brixton turned from the window, where he'd been standing backlit by the gray Santa Fe dawn. When his eyes found me looking at the briefcase, he smiled. Not the smile of a nephew at his uncle's deathbed. The smile of a man who'd shown up early to an auction, already knowing which lot he intended to take. I stood in that doorway long enough to watch Brixton check his phone twice, and then redirect his attention to the briefcase with the focused calm of someone monitoring an investment. Then I left. I was standing alone in the hospice hallway at 2 o'clock in the morning when a hand came down on my shoulder from behind, and a voice I hadn't heard in 3 years dropped to a whisper. Uncle, we need to talk, right now. Keldon Halver stepped out of the shadows near the vending machines, 38 weathered from years inspecting building codes in Colorado mountain towns. Doan's son. The overhead fluorescence had been dimmed for the night shift, and his face looked haggard in the blue-white glow of the Coke machine. When did you get here? I kept my voice low. An hour ago. He glanced toward the room 314, then pulled me into the alcove by the supply closet. His grip was tight enough to leave a mark. Uncle, do not sign anything my cousin puts in front of you. I don't care how he frames it or how routine he makes it sound. Do not put your name on a single page he brings you. The coffee I'd been drinking turned to acid in my gut. Keldon, that's my son. You're talking about? What exactly are you saying he's done? I'm not accusing. I'm warning. His eyes were bloodshot. He'd driven straight through from Durango without a stop. He has something that has to get done before Monday, and he was desperate enough that I drove 7 hours in the middle of the night to make sure you heard it from me first. What does Monday have to do with anything? I don't know. Keldon dragged a hand through his hair, a gesture so much like Doan that my chest clenched. But 3 weeks ago, Brixton called me asking about Dad's estate. Wanted to know about streamlining probate. Kept using phrases like avoiding unnecessary complications and making sure everything transfers smoothly. Your father's not even, I couldn't get the word out. Dead yet, I know? Keldon's voice broke. Then I called Dad's attorney myself. Someone using Brixton's name had requested copies of the trust documents 2 months ago before Dad even had the terminal diagnosis. I had raised Brixton alone after his mother died when he was 7. I thought I knew every expression that could cross his face. But Keldon was describing a stranger wearing my son's name. Why are you telling me this now? Because yesterday Brixton called me, again asked whether you had arrived, asked if you were being cooperative about family matters. Keldon's hand was still on my arm. Uncle Court. My cousin is running some kind of clock, and whatever he needs it before Monday morning. Promise me you won't sign anything without calling a lawyer first. I promise. He studied my face, then let go of my arm. I'll be close by if Brixton tries anything. I'll find you. He disappeared down the hallway toward room 314. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. By late afternoon on November 1st, I'd been awake for 36 hours. The third-floor waiting room smelled of industrial carpet cleaner and the quiet dread of 24 families trading shifts at deathbeds. I sat in a vinyl chair by the windows, pretending to read a dog-eared copy of Field and Stream, while Brixton paced the far wall with his phone pressed to his ear, His voice carried across the room. No, Sunday at the latest. The old man's not going to last through next week. It has to be finalized before Monday. The words on the page meant nothing. I don't care what it takes, Brixton was saying, voice gone hard and clipped. No signatures by Sunday night and this whole thing unravels. Monday is a wall, it doesn't move. He killed the call and turned to face the Santa Fe foothills through the glass. Tegan materialized beside my chair tablet tucked under her arm, wearing that professionally neutral expression nurses earn through years of practice. Mr. Halver, she said it loud enough to pull Brixton's head around. There's a notary booked for Sunday at 2 o'clock. Your son set it up. Did you want to reschedule? The magazine dropped out of my hands. A notary. I held my voice flat. For what exactly? Her eyes moved to Brixton, then back to me. End-of-life paperwork, I'd assumed. Power of attorney, that kind of thing. Routine, Dad, Brixton said, already crossing toward me with that deal-maker's grin. Just getting our ducks in a row in case Uncle Doan. He let it hang there, face arranged into something that looked like grief, but his eyes were running numbers. A notary, a Sunday afternoon. A deadline that turned to stone on Monday morning. What kind of legitimate family business requires that particular combination? I'll be in touch about the time, I said to Tegan. Brixton dropped into the seat beside me, close enough that his aftershave reached me sharp and wrong for a hospice. I understand this is painful, but we can't afford to be sentimental right now. If Doan goes without the right documents in place, we're looking at probate tying everything up for years. This is about protecting what the family's built. 39 years old, my son. I'd shown him how to ride without training wheels, sat with him over kitchen tables, teaching him how to read a bank statement. And now I was looking at a stranger who'd turned those same careful instincts toward an equation with Monday as its answer. Later, I said. We'll get into it later. I went back to Doan's room and stopped in the doorway. Brixton was at the bed, repositioning the pillows behind my brother's head, with smooth, deliberate care, the movements of someone who'd decided how this scene should look. He didn't register me. His attention kept drifting back to the leather briefcase on the bedside chair, the way a man's eyes return to a contract he's waiting to close. 48 hours to Monday. I had spent 63 years certain that some things couldn't happen between people who shared blood. I was about to lose that certainty. It started at 8:30 Saturday morning. The first thing Doan said clearly in 2 days was, "Changed the will." Then his hand locked around my wrist with a force that had no business existing in a man wasting down to nothing, and he pulled me close. The frozen lake court. The frozen lake? Do you remember? I was bent over the bed rail in room 314, near enough to catch the sweet-sour smell his body was giving off, as it shut down near enough to see the yellow creeping into the whites of his eyes. 90 pounds. That's what was left of my brother. Doan? I'm right here. Tell me. Changed it. His voice scraped out like something dragged over gravel. Said it was simplified. The frozen lake court, you crawled out and pulled me back. Now you have to. His fingers dug harder into my wrist. I could feel my own pulse trapped under them. Have to what Doan talked to me. Who changed what your will? Tell me what happened. January 1973. Eagle Nest, Lake, New Mexico. The ice fishing trip where Doan broke through 100 yards from the bank. I was 19 home from community college over winter break. The sound the ice made when it gave like a rifle shot in air so cold it had a texture. I went out flat on my belly, spreading my weight across the surface and dragged him out of water that had gone beyond cold into something else, something that wanted to keep him. For the next 50 years, he said the same thing every time it came up. You handed me back my life court. There's no settling a debt like that. Dying now, he was presenting the bill. Don't let him. Doan's eyes went knife sharp for just a moment. Sign Monday the cabin, all of it. Then the grip dissolved. The morphine took him back down like a current, and his breathing sank into that dreadful wet rattle time, audible measured out in the fluid his lungs were drowning in. I stood holding his slack hand, the red impressions of his fingers still rising on my wrist, and turned over what he'd managed to say. Someone had touched his will, framed it as a simplification, and whatever they'd done to it had scared Doan badly enough to claw his way through the morphine fog and make sure I heard it. I had pulled my brother from a frozen lake in New Mexico in January of 1973, half a century of him telling me the debt was beyond repayment. And here at the end, in a room that smelled of cedar oil and antiseptic, he was calling it due. 3 hours later, I found Keldon outside. He was propped against his truck, a 10-year-old Chevy Colorado, with Colorado plates working through a cigarette, with the grim focus of someone who'd been clean for 5 years until yesterday. The November sky over Santa Fe had gone the color of old pewter. Wind off the foothills carried sage and the front edge of snow. "Uncle Court." He crushed the cigarette under his boot and stepped toward me. "We can't talk in there, not where Brixton might walk past." "Go ahead." He threw a glance back at the building, then dropped his voice to something barely above a breath. "Brixton is into people for $280,000. Not a bank, the kind of people who don't send collection letters. He hits Monday at 5 p.m. without the money, and they come find him, personally." The ground did something strange under my feet. $280,000. How does a credentialed insurance man end up buried that deep, offshore sports books and underground poker? Probably borrowed from sharks to dig out of the early holes, and only dug deeper. Keldon opened his phone and walked me through a chain of screenshots texts between him and Brixton, 3 weeks old. Brixton had reached out asking for help, persuading his father to clean up the estate paperwork while there was still time. Said he wanted to head off probate complications. I read through them slowly. The tone was polished professional, the voice of a man who spent his days explaining policy terms. But the subtext was a fist through glass. "Uncle Court," Keldon said. "My father is still drawing breath. How did you find out about the money? Brix's ex rang me 2 nights ago. She said threatening calls have been coming for weeks, strange men turning up at his building. She got out last month, said she was frightened they'd go through her to reach him." He pocketed the phone. "She told me they said Monday at 5 o'clock. If he's short, they start with his knees and go from there." A gust scattered dead leaves across the asphalt. "What's the estate add up to?" I asked. I already suspected the answer would make the whole picture snap into focus. The cabin at Eagle Nest Lake was appraised at $850,000 last year. There's a $500,000 life insurance policy. Trust account somewhere around $120,000. Altogether, it's pushing $1.5 million. Keldon's jaw set hard. 3 weeks ago, Brixton asked me to help talk Dad into signing the cabin over early. Probate delays, same story. Except Dad is still alive and breathing in that room right now. My son. My only child. I'd raised him alone from the age of 7, the year his mother lost her fight with breast cancer. He's not looking to wait around for what's coming to him, I said. The thought came out barely formed. No. Keldon's voice carried no give in it at all. He's trying to take it before it's his to take. What does a man do when the scale holds his own blood on one side and a dying brother's last request on the other when there's no way to honor both? Keldon's voice went down to almost nothing. Uncle Court, your son, doesn't have designs on an eventual inheritance. He needs cash in hand by Monday afternoon, or men who treat kneecaps as a starting point are going to land him in a hospital room down the hall from my father. Standing in that cold November lot, I finally understood the shape of it. Brixton wasn't maneuvering for a bigger share of what would someday be his. He intended to use my name on a document to buy himself out of a situation that would otherwise kill him. Whatever he had to reduce to ash in the process was a secondary concern. The notary came tomorrow at 2 o'clock. Monday's deadline sat 41 hours out, and I had no clear picture of what was actually inside that briefcase or what story Brixton had prepared to walk me through until my pen was moving. Watching your son lie to your face is hard enough. Knowing he's doing it because he's terrified for his life makes it worse. Not easier, worse. 2 hours after Keldon laid it all out for me, Brixton came into Doan's room with a thin manila folder tucked under his arm. He went straight to the bed and resettled the pillows the way he always did, smooth, unhurried, like a man with all the time in the world. Then he turned to me and said, with the unruffled calm of someone who had rehearsed every word, "Dad, we should probably talk through some practical steps to keep things moving without probate delays." Room 314 held the smell of lunch trays and the antiseptic bite of disinfectant. Doan lay sleeping, each breath shallow and deliberate. Across the hall, Tegan was at the monitor station running vitals. Brixton settled into the visitor's chair, opened the folder, and looked up at me with the composed ease of a man who had already decided how this conversation would end. "The language in here is dense, I know," he started, voice low and carefully soothing. "But all you're doing is signing as a witness. Uncle Doan and I worked this out between us weeks back. It's a formality, keeps the state from freezing his assets in probate limbo for 18 months. I watched him the way I used to scrutinize shipping manifests, hunting for the figures that refused to reconcile. If Doan had already signed off on this weeks ago, why does my name need to go on it today? Brix's smile held without a tremor. Because walking Dad through legal prose at this point would only wear him out. I deal with estate claims every working day. This is completely standard. Beneficiary designation forms transfer on death deeds. It just keeps the lawyers from dragging things out and the state from taking its cut over the next year and a half. He slid the first page across the bedside table in my direction. I looked at it. The header read, "Revocable transfer on death deed real property. This hands over the cabin," I said. "Only after Uncle Doan passes, and only to sidestep probate." Brixton answered, patient and faintly condescending. "Dad, estate law can feel enormous when you're standing in the middle of it, but this is exactly what families do to protect each other from bureaucratic nightmares. Would you rather see the cabin stuck in court while some judge waits to find out if Keldon filed the right forms? Yow?" I see. Every syllable had been chosen to make me feel elderly spent out of my depth, and I could see the architecture of it now, each careful phrase, each calibrated pause. The worry in his voice wasn't concern. It was a precision instrument wielded by someone who had been professionally trained in the art of getting people to put their names on papers they hadn't truly read. 37 years I'd spent teaching my son to read people to feel for the gap between what someone says and what they're actually after. He'd absorbed the lesson completely, and now he was running it against his own family. "I'm reading every page," I said. Brix's jaw tightened just a fraction, just for a beat. Then the smile came back. "Of course, Dad. Take whatever time you need. I just figured, given how brutal the last few days have been, you might be willing to let your son carry the details for once." "I'll read them tonight," I said. "Everyone." He studied me, taking his measure. Then he gathered the folder off the table and got to his feet. "Sure, we've got until tomorrow afternoon. Notary's at 2. He left. I sat listening to Doan's labored breathing and turned one question over in my mind. How does a man plant himself at his dying uncle's bedside and perform that kind of theater without his hands betraying him? Keldon came back to the hospice at 9:30 that night, after Brixton had returned to his hotel. We waited for the night shift to settle in, and for the hallways to go quiet. "Dad kept some personal things in the closet," Keldon said, pulling the narrow door open beside the bathroom. "Letters, photographs. I thought there might be something in there about what he was reaching for this morning." We found it a weathered manila envelope wedged behind a stack of folded clothes, photographs from January 1973. The first image showed Eagle Nest Lake white and vast under a pewter sky. The second showed a younger version of me, 19, hair still dark, wearing a soaked winter coat, kneeling beside a figure bundled in blankets. The third showed Doan, barely conscious lips, blue being loaded into an ambulance. Inside the envelope was a letter in Doan's careful hand. The paper had gone yellow, the ink faded to brown. Keldon read it aloud in the quiet of the sterile room. January 18th, 1973. My brother Court pulled me out of Eagle Nest Lake after I went through the ice checking a trap line. I was under for 90 seconds. He went in without hesitation, 30-degree water, and dragged me to shore. The paramedic said he performed CPR for 7 minutes straight, refused to quit even when they told him I was gone. A man who saves your life owns a piece of your soul forever. If I ever have something worth protecting, it will be his to guard. I hadn't known he'd written that. Hadn't known he'd kept the photographs. Keldon set the letter down on the bedside table. "Uncle Court, this is why Dad named you executor. Not your age, not the way you handle money. Because 50 years ago, you proved you'd put yourself on the line to bring him back. He needs that same person standing between his legacy and what's happening right now." I picked up the photograph of the frozen lake. The cold came back to me the way it scorched your lungs, the way your fingers went from burning to simply absent. I could still hear the crack. The ice made the splash when Doan dropped through into black water. I'd been a teenager. I hadn't calculated anything. I hadn't weighed the risk. My brother was gone beneath the surface, and I went in after him. That was the whole of it. That letter transformed Doan's estate into something that couldn't be measured in dollars or square footage. It was a 50-year-old pledge written in ice water and hypothermia, and 7 minutes of CPR that wouldn't stop. "Keldon," I said quietly, "when that notary walks in tomorrow, I want you in the room. I need someone standing there who isn't trying to strip your father's estate to the bone." I'll be there." We sat without speaking for a while, listening to Doan breathe. The photographs were spread across the bedside table like exhibits at a hearing. I held the yellowed image of two brothers on a frozen lake in 1973, one of them soaking and shaking the other, wrapped in an ambulance blanket, fighting to stay in the world. And I finally understood what Doan had been pushing through the morphine to say. He wasn't transferring assets, wasn't handing over a cabin and some insurance policies. He was passing me 50 years of absolute trust and asking me to prove one final time that I was the man who deserved to hold it. And tomorrow at 2, Brixton was bringing a notary. Tomorrow arrived. I came down to the hospice reception desk at 7:30 Sunday morning and found Brixton already there, leaning over the counter with his phone out, confirming an appointment with someone he kept addressing as the notary. The third-floor reception area smelled of fresh coffee and floor wax. Morning light cut through the east-facing windows at a low angle, turning the linoleum to pale gold. Tegan stood behind the desk, entering notes into her tablet, her expression giving nothing away. Brixton's voice carried in the stillness. "Yes. 2 o'clock this afternoon, room 314. 3 signatures required, the principal a witness and the notary's seal. Should run 15 minutes at most." He turned slightly and found me standing in the hallway. For just a sliver of a second, something moved across his face, a poker player's involuntary reaction to a card he hadn't counted on. Then the professional mask sealed back into place. "Morning, Dad." He pocketed the phone in one smooth motion. "Just nailing down the time with Mr. Culver. Standard estate paperwork keeps everything moving when the moment comes." 3 signatures. I stepped closer. "What exactly are we signing?" Brixton transfer on death deeds, beneficiary designations, the kind of documents that prevent the state from tying up Uncle Doan's assets for the next 18 months. He held the smile, but his eyes were calibrating me. "We covered this yesterday, Dad. It's completely routine." Tegan glanced up briefly from her tablet, then looked back down. Her fingers kept moving. "Then bring me those documents this morning," I said, voice steady and unhurried. "I'll spend the next 6 hours going through every word, every clause, every signature line. If something's unclear, I ask questions. If I'm not satisfied, the notary can make the drive back for nothing." Brix's jaw tightened. "Dad, you're running on empty. 3 days here, almost no sleep. I'm trying to reduce your load, not add to it." "Then reducing my load means giving me the time to read," I said. I cut off whatever came next. "Unless there's a reason you need my signature today that you haven't mentioned." The silence ran for 3 full beats. Brixton's smile stayed in place, but something cold moved behind his eyes. "Of course you can read them, Dad. I just thought, given your age and how impenetrable legal language can get, you might be willing to trust your son with the technical side of this." There it was again, the gentle, persistent suggestion that I was too worn down, too old, too foggy to grasp what I was being handed to sign. I had spent 63 years being the man who extended trust first and asked questions later. Over the next 6 hours, I was going to become the man who trusted nothing and questioned everything. "I'll read every page," I said. "Starting now." Brix's composure came apart at the seams. His voice climbed half an octave. "Dad, this is insulting. I'm your son. I work in insurance. I handle estate claims every single day of my professional life. I know what I'm doing. Then you won't have any objection to me checking your work. This is ridiculous." His hand cut sharply through the air, the smooth, professional surface falling away. "You're treating me like I'm some kind of grifter instead of your own child. Do you have any idea what that does to me?" Tegan's fingers went still on her tablet. Her eyes moved from Brixton to me, then dropped back to her screen. But I could see she was paying close attention. Now the kind of focused, watchful stillness that comes from years of observing family dynamics curdle into something ugly. "I'm treating you like someone who booked a notary without asking me," I said, keeping my voice level. "Someone who's been pressing me to sign papers I haven't laid eyes on. Someone who showed up at his dying uncle's bedside 12 hours before I even received the call. So, yes, Brixton, I'm going to read every single word before my name goes anywhere near a signature line." His face went red. "You know what, fine. Read all day if that's what you need, but the notary still comes at 2, and if you're not ready to sign by, then that's your problem, not mine. Don't blame me when Uncle Doan's estate gets buried in probate for the next 2 years." He turned sharply and headed for the elevators. I watched him go, pulse hammering in my chest. Tegan waited until the elevator doors had closed, then raised her eyes from her tablet. Her face hadn't changed, but her voice was measured when she spoke. Mr. Halver, I've been doing hospice work for 10 years. I've watched a lot of families try to navigate these moments. She paused, choosing her words the way you'd pick your footing on ice. If you want to go through documents before you sign them, that's not just your right. It's the only sensible thing to do. Take whatever time you need. Thank you. She tapped something into her tablet. Just entering some notes in the patient file, documenting the sequence of events standard practice when estate matters get complicated. How many people had Tegan watched lose everything to a well-dressed relative with a leather briefcase and a reassuring explanation? I appreciate it, I said. She gave a single nod and returned to the screen, but I could see the deliberateness in her posture, the careful precision of every keystroke. She was building a record timestamps exchange as witnesses, a paper trail in case someone needed it later. I went back to room 314. Doan was asleep, his breathing uneven and rough. The morning light through the window made his skin look almost translucent, the dark lines of his veins visible beneath the surface like rivers on a relief map. I settled into the visitor's chair and sat with it. Brixton had walked away down the corridor with his shoulders locked tight against the fury underneath. And I knew I'd just forced something. Whatever those documents contained, whatever he needed my signature for before Monday at 5 o'clock, he was going to have to bring them out into the open in the flat light of a Sunday morning, with 6 hours left on the clock. I didn't yet know what was buried in those pages. I only knew it was the kind of thing that could shatter a family beyond repair. Outside the window, Santa Fe lay spread under a pewter sky. Somewhere in the city, a mobile notary named Mr. Culver was getting ready for a 2 o'clock appointment. And somewhere in a hotel room, or a car, or wearing a track in some parking lot, my son was working out exactly how far he was prepared to go before Monday's deadline hit. At noon, I found out what was buried in those pages. The footsteps came down the third-floor corridor at exactly 12 o'clock, 4 hours ahead of schedule. When I looked up from Doan's bedside, a man in a gray suit was coming through the door, carrying a briefcase stamped with an official notary seal. Boyd Culver was 52. Balding with the deliberate uprightness of someone who'd spent decades witnessing signatures on documents he never examined too closely. Brixton came in behind him, moving with the pressed-down urgency of a man who'd shifted his timeline forward and needed everyone to act like it had always been the plan. "Good thing we're on time," Brixton said loud enough to fill the room. "My father's been waiting all morning to take care of this." I stepped into the hallway. The appointment was set for 2 o'clock. It's noon. Boyd stopped, a flicker of confusion crossing his face. He pulled out his phone and scrolled. "I had a text come in at 10:30 this morning, asking me to arrive early. I assumed everyone had been informed." "I wasn't," I said. Brix's smile held. "Dad, I texted you this morning. You must have missed it. I moved things up so you could get some rest this afternoon, instead of sitting here watching the clock all the way to 2 o'clock. He hadn't sent any text. I'd been checking my phone every 15 minutes since 7 a.m. Tegan appeared in the doorway of the nurse's station, tablet in hand. She didn't say a word, but I could see her screen flare as she started typing. "Let's not keep Mr. Culver waiting," Brixton said smoothly, gesturing toward room 314. "We can work out the scheduling mix-up afterward. I had been the one who taught my son to show up early to own the room, to define the terms before the other person understood what game was being played. And here he was, running every one of those lessons back at me to strip his dying Uncle bare. "Come in," I said to Boyd, "but nothing gets signed until I've read every page." Inside room 314, the air carried the smell of antiseptic and the faint sour undercurrent of illness. Doan lay unconscious, his breathing shallow and wet. Someone had swung the overbed tray table across his chest like a workstation. Boyd set his briefcase on the visitor's chair and drew out a thick stack of documents bound with a black binder clip. He laid them on the tray table with the pages fanned just enough that I could see signature lines at the bottom of the top 3 sheets. "I'll need signatures on pages 1, 3, and 7. Boyd said, his tone pleasantly professional. "Each party signs at the marked lines. I apply the notary seal and we're finished. Shouldn't take more than 10 minutes. He produced a pen from his jacket and held it out toward me. I didn't take it. I need to go through each document separately before any signatures happen. Brix's jaw clenched. "Dad, we've covered this. These are standard forms. Mr. Culver's time is valuable." "Then he can spare a few minutes," I said, reaching for the stack. Brix's hand shot out and pressed flat onto the papers, pinning them against the table. For 3 full seconds, we held that position. My hand on the top page, his hand bearing down on the stack, both of us looking at each other across my brother's failing body. "Dad," his voice dropped to something quiet and controlled. "You're embarrassing yourself. Mr. Culver is a licensed professional. He's already verified these documents are in order. All that's left is the signatures. Then you won't have any objection to me reading them first." I pulled the top page free from under his hand. The header read, "Quitclaim, Deed Real Property." Below it, legal language describing the transfer of one parcel of land at Eagle Nest Lake, New Mexico, from Doan Halver to Brixton Halver, effective immediately upon execution, not upon death, immediately. My hands started to shake. I set that page aside and looked at the second document. The header turned my blood cold. "Immediate durable power of attorney, full financial and legal authority." I read through the body. The language handed Brixton complete control over all of Doan's financial accounts, real estate holdings, and legal decisions, effective the moment the ink dried and the notary pressed his seal. Not temporary, not limited to incapacitation, not conditional on anything at all, immediate and total. The document stack was arranged like a hand dealt by a card sharp. Every signature line clearly visible at the bottom of each page. Every clause that actually mattered buried one layer in where tired and grieving eyes wouldn't think to look. "This isn't a transfer on death deed," I said, keeping my voice quiet and even. "This is an immediate transfer. And this power of attorney gives you total control the second this gets notarized." Boyd's professional composure showed its first crack. He leaned in to look at the pages. Brixton's face went red. "Dad, you're misreading the legal language. That's exactly the confusion I was trying to save you from terminology that sounds alarming when you don't work with it every day." "I understand it fine." I turned to the third page. My stomach dropped through the floor. The third document was a life insurance beneficiary designation form. The policy number at the top matched the $500,000 policy Keldon had mentioned. The field marked current beneficiary showed Keldon Halver's name in typed letters. The field-marked replacement beneficiary held a blank line waiting for a signature that would redirect $500,000 away from Doan's son and toward Doan's nephew, from Keldon to Brixton. "Jesus Christ," I whispered. Boyd stepped back from the table, his hand moving toward his briefcase. "Mr. Halver, I was engaged for what I was told was a routine estate planning session. If the parties are in dispute about the terms—" "There's no dispute," Brixton cut in, his voice climbing. "My father is having difficulty processing complex legal language. That's what I'm here to help with." "I understand it perfectly," I said, my voice cold and flat. "You're not streamlining probate. You're stripping everything your uncle owns while he's still drawing breath. The cabin, the insurance money, total financial control, and you need my signature as a witness to make it stick." I looked at my son, 39 years old, standing at his dying uncle's bedside with a set of documents engineered to take everything that man had spent a lifetime building. "You're not getting it," I said. And that's when Doan's eyes opened. Doan lay there with his eyes open, watching. I went through section 2.1 of the power of attorney 3 times before the true weight of those words hit me like a loaded freight truck. Agent shall have immediate unrestricted authority over principals, assets, accounts, property transfers, and all financial decisions, effective upon execution of this document, not upon death, upon execution, the moment the ink dried. "That this activates the second we sign," I said, keeping my voice flat against the fury rising in my chest. "Not after Doan was gone right now today, this room. What kind of dying man surrenders financial control while he's still drawing breath?" Brixton's jaw went rigid. "It's asset protection, Dad. Standard practice stops the courts from freezing things up. Courts don't freeze a living person's accounts." "Try again," I said, and stopped him there. Boyd Culver shifted near the foot of the bed, briefcase pulled against his torso like a shield. The arithmetic was moving behind his eyes, a professional realizing the routine estate signing he'd been promised was something else entirely. "Mr. Halver," he said, choosing his words carefully and directing them at Brixton. "This morning, you described a standard transfer on death arrangement. An immediate power of attorney is a fundamentally different instrument. It demands additional disclosures." A pause. "It's legal, but it is not the same thing." Brixton's control slipped. "I don't need a notary explaining state law to me. Insurance is my field. I work these cases every day. Working claims and drafting documents aren't the same profession, I said quietly. I brought the power of attorney back in front of me, precise surgical language built to read as protection while functioning as a snare. Agent may sell transfer mortgage or otherwise dispose of any real property. The cabin. Agent may access withdraw transfer or close any financial accounts. The trust funds. Agent may act without seeking court approval or beneficiary consent. Keldon would have no standing to object when his father's estate quietly emptied out. My son had mastered the vocabulary of exploitation, every clause engineered to mimic a safeguard while doing the opposite, every phrase calibrated to blunt suspicion while pulling off a clean legal mugging. And this hands you the power to liquidate everything Doan owns, I said. Right now, man still breathing, you could move on the cabin, drain the trust accounts, and he'd have no way to fight it. That's not what this is for, Brixton said, the smoothness gone from his voice now. You're reading it wrong on purpose. Am I? He had nothing. I set that document aside and lifted the third. Header beneficiary designation, change life insurance policy. Policy number, neat across the top. In the field marked current beneficiary block, letters spelled out Keldon Holver in blue ink. Above it, written over in black ink that looked newer, was Brixton Holver. Keldon's name had a single blue line through it, different handwriting on each entry. The form was dated November 1st, 3 days back, when Doan had been so deeply medicated he'd lose a sentence before he could finish it. This form has Keldon's name struck out and yours above it, I said, voice dropping to something dangerous. Where's the paperwork showing Keldon agreed to walk away from $500,000 each or den more spins? That was resolved weeks ago, Brixton said quickly. Keldon and I had an arrangement part of the overall estate plan. Boyd's tone shifted the professional courtesy, hardening into something closer to controlled anger. Mr. Halver, before I notarize a transfer of this size, I need direct confirmation from the named beneficiary. A $500,000 policy change requires... I don't need a tutorial on insurance procedures, Brixton snapped. Regardless, Boyd said flatly. This form carries alterations in 2 different inks, 2 different hands, and a date that falls inside a window of heavy sedation. I've notarized thousands of documents, Mr. Halver. I know what fraud looks like. The room went quiet, only the rasp of Doan's breathing and the steady hum of machines. Brixton's face flushed dark. You're calling me a fraud? I'm trying to protect my family's legacy from probate attorneys picking at the bones, and you're standing here? I'm not calling you anything, Boyd said quietly. I'm declining. I will not notarize these documents without independent verification from every affected party and review by an estate attorney. Good afternoon. He picked up his briefcase and moved toward the door. You can't leave, I paid you. Brixton's voice climbed. Deposit returned, Boyd said, not turning around. I don't put my stamp on elder exploitation. Tegan Morrow was in the doorway. She didn't step aside. She came further in tablet, raised at chest-height screen, facing out. Mr. Halver, she said to Brixton, all professional frost. This interaction has been logged with timestamps under the Patient Protection Protocol. The hospice administrator will be reviewing the file this afternoon. How many hours had Brixton spent engineering these documents, threading every phrase through the needle of what would hold up legally while gutting his own family? His hands were shaking now. Dad, you're letting these people use you against me. I'm your son. Everything here is to protect this family. By robbing it, I said. I glanced up from the beneficiary form. Doan was watching me from the bed eyes clearer than they'd been in days, and tears moved silently down into the pillow. He knew. He understood exactly what his nephew had been constructing, and what remained of his strength wasn't enough to stop it with anything but those tears. This was no estate adjustment, no probate efficiency measure. It was outright theft wearing legal clothes, and my son meant to execute it using my own signature as the weapon. The document sat on the overbed table, every signature line blank. Through the window, Santa Fe spread gray under a November sky. The clock read 12:47 p.m. Somewhere out in that city, men with collection schedules were watching their own clocks count toward Monday at 5. My son had 32 hours to find another exit. I'd just made sure this wasn't it. Except he didn't really have 32 hours. He had about 30 seconds before I took his last option off the table. I pulled out my phone, found Keldon's number, and looked at Brixton with a voice honed to an edge. We're calling your cousin right now, and you're going to ask him on speakerphone whether he agreed to forfeit $500,000. All the color left Brixton's face. Dad, don't... I stepped into the hallway. Boyd came with me. Behind us, Tegan watched from her station tablet glowing. 2 rings. Uncle Court, it's Dad. Your father's holding stable, I said, switching to speaker. Keldon, did you ever agree to waive your rights as beneficiary on your father's life insurance policy? Silence. No, Uncle Court, I never agreed to change anything. What beneficiary form? I have no idea what you're describing. Brixton made a sound like he'd been hit. Keldon, 3 weeks ago, did Brixton reach out asking you to help persuade your father to consolidate the estate paperwork? He called. I told him no. Dad's estate was Dad's to manage, and I wasn't going to sit around talking money while my father was dying. Uncle Court, what's happening? 15 seconds. I watched my son move through shock, fury, calculation, then raw desperation. The face looking back at me belonged to someone I no longer recognized. Keldon, did you know you're the named beneficiary on your father's life insurance? I assumed he had something like that. Never asked the specifics. $500,000. The silence stretched long. Jesus, Keldon whispered, and Brixton lunged for some response. He found nothing. I'll call back, I said, and ended it. Boyd was already logging on his phone, the notary building his own record. You had no right, Brixton said, shaking. No right to interfere with fraud, I cut across him. With theft? He's medicated. He doesn't comprehend what he's authorizing. Someone has to act before probate ties everything up for years. That someone isn't you, I said quietly. I walked back into room 314. Brixton followed. Doan was awake, those pale blue eyes having absorbed all of it, the briefcase, the notary, the documents, the argument, tears still running into the pillow. Brixton reached for the document folder on the bedside table. I put my hand flat against his chest and stopped him. Move, he said through clenched teeth. No. You don't understand what you're costing me. I need those documents. I need them by tomorrow or... He stopped. What went unspoken filled the room anyway. I need this by tomorrow or they're gonna kill me. He swallowed it back. He's not lucid, Brixton shouted instead, gesturing at Doan. You heard him yesterday, he doesn't know what day it is. Any court would rule him incompetent in 5 minutes. And then let the courts rule, I said. But my signature stays off those pages. These documents don't leave with you, and neither do you. You're choosing him over me. Brixton's voice cracked open at the seam. You're my father's only child, and here you stand, throwing a shield around a man with maybe 7 days left. While he cut himself off, but the rest of it hung in the air between us. While he was dodging men who collect debts with broken fingers and shallow graves. I'm the one protecting someone who can't do it himself, I said, keeping my voice flat. From his own blood. From you. And yes, Brixton, that's exactly the choice I'm making. Something moved across his face then. Fury and grief and raw fear, all of them crowding in at once. You have no idea what you've set in motion, he breathed. No idea what the price of this is. I know the price down to the last cent, I said. Leave Dad. Walk out of this room. Walk out of this building. Don't show your face here again until you're willing to sit across from me and tell me the full truth, every name you owe, and every dollar attached to it. Brixton's chest heaved. His hands kept clenching and releasing at his sides. Then he moved not toward me, but toward the bedside table. His arm swung past my face, grabbing for the papers. I locked onto his wrist and threw him backward. He nearly went down. Leave, I said. The two of us faced each other over 3 feet of stale hospice air. Father and son. One protecting, one praying. Brixton's whole frame seemed to deflate. I hope you can live with this, he said, the words scraped hollow. When they pull me out of a ditch somewhere, I want you to think back to right now. He moved to the doorway and stopped. 3 full seconds he stood there, fury, desperation, and something that looked a lot like real terror carved into his face before he disappeared down the corridor without a sound. I stayed where I was, tracking his footsteps, until they dissolved my pulse hammering in my ears. I had driven my own son out of his dying uncle's room. I'd weighed Doan's legacy against Brixton's survival and made my call, and I knew the fallout was going to hit like a freight train. But watching Doan press my hand with the last reserves of his strength, I understood there had never been another option. Boyd materialized in the doorway, briefcase in hand. Mr. Halver, he said, voice low. Everything that took place in this room today is on the record. Should you require a sworn statement for any legal action, you know how to reach me. Thank you. He was gone. Tegan came through the door a moment later with a fresh pitcher of water. Security escorted your son to the parking lot, she said, eyes on the chart. His name is in the system now. No one lets him back onto this floor without sign-off from administration. I gave a single nod. She moved through the room, methodically checking Doan's IV line, resetting his oxygen, logging her notes. Precise and unhurried running interference between a patient and the people who were supposed to love him. The way I suspected she'd done more times than she could count. After she left, I pulled a chair close and took my brother's hand. What I hadn't reckoned with yet was that Brixton had already put something else in motion. Something 3 weeks deep before I'd even caught wind of it. Keldon's text hit my phone at 5:47 Monday morning in the parking lot. Got emails. You need to see them now. He's already moving the property. I dragged on the same clothes I'd had on the day before and went down 3 flights of stairs each step, sending a complaint through both knees. November had settled cold and gray over Santa Fe, the bone-deep kind that doesn't loosen until spring. Keldon was leaning against his truck, the screen on his phone casting pale light across his face. Got into Brixton's email using a password he never changed. He told me no. Wind up. I know that's not something I should have done, but Uncle Court has to see this. He put the phone in my hand. On the screen was a chain of messages between Brixton and a man named Dex Farlow Mountain West. Properties Coeur d'Alene. The first email was dated October 18th. Professional photography of the Eagle Nest Lake property completed as requested. Attached 47 high-resolution images for listing materials. I kept scrolling. October 22nd draft listing agreement attached. Suggested asking price $875,000 based on recent comparable sales and waterfront premium. 3 weeks old, I said barely above a whisper. 3 weeks ago, your father was still on his feet. Keep going, Keldon said. His voice had a tremor in it. November, first 48 hours ahead of the notary ambush, a message from Dex Farlow, subject line, preliminary offer, Eagle Nest Lake. A California investment group, Clearwater Holdings, LLC, coming in at $850,000, cash, 10-day close, all inspection contingencies waived. Confirm financing, recommending you proceed. Brixton had written back at 11:34 p.m. on November 1st, pending family signature approval. Target close date November 8th. Will confirm by end of week. While Doan lay 50 meters down that hallway, too weak to lift a cup, asking where everyone had gone, my son had been quietly packaging his property for a California buyer, and I was the one who had put that man in the world. That's not all, Keldon said. He scrolled to another folder. Text messages. The contact was listed as nothing but a number, Las Vegas area code. Saturday 11:47 p.m. Payment due. Monday 5 p.m. Mountain time or the collection team moves. Tuesday morning. No extensions, no negotiations. Then Sunday. Confirm you received this notice. Brixton had replied, confirmed. Funds arrive Monday afternoon. The last message had come in at 3:22 a.m., 2 hours before Keldon woke me. 5 p.m. or we begin collection. You understand what that means? You understand we don't bluff. Today, Keldon said. 12 hours from right now. We drove 3 blocks and took a booth at the High Desert Grill. The coffee tasted like scorched cardboard, but neither of us was tasting anything. If he gets that property deed transferred, I said he turns around and either borrows against it or hands it to the Clearwater people before the week is out. Offers open 10 days. Closes on the 8th. Keldon wrapped both hands around his mug and stared down into it. Uncle Court, do we stop him? Do we let Brixton go under to protect what my father wanted? The kitchen fan droned. Someone back there called out in Spanish. Through the plate glass, Santa Fe was grinding into another Monday engines, turning over headlights, cutting the dark, the world moving on its ordinary axle. My son had 12 hours before the men on that Las Vegas number came to settle the account with their hands. He'd tried to shatter his uncle's trust to save himself, and now the clock was running. No, I said. Keldon's eyes came up. We stop him, I said. But we don't hand him to those people empty. We document everything, and we build something solid. By 10:15, we were back inside the Hospice Business Center's printer working hard. I ran copies of every page Brixton had brought. Sunday, the quitclaim deed drafted for an immediate handover. the power of attorney, that would have made him the sole financial authority, the beneficiary form where Keldon's name had been struck through in ink that didn't match the rest. Boyd Culver walked in at 10:30 with a leather portfolio under his arm. "I need a formal incident report covering yesterday's signing attempt," I told him, and I walked him through the whole sequence: the early arrival, the documents stacked and ready to call on speakerphone. "I've had a head start on that," he said. He laid the portfolio open, 3 typed pages already filled. 30 years doing this work, and I can count on one hand the attempts I'd call this brazen. The law requires me to flag suspected elder exploitation with the state. Keldon got photos of all the real estate emails and pushed them to my address with the timestamps intact. How do you love someone and still do this to them? And what do you do when the answer has to come inside 12 hours? I gathered it all into a manila envelope. Copies of the fraudulent paperwork, Boyd's incident report, screenshots of the property emails, Keldon's written account of the speakerphone call, the text thread from the Las Vegas number. Everything signed, dated, witnessed a legal wall around a dying man's wishes. What exactly are we putting together? Uncle Court Keldon asked, his voice gone quiet. A case that sends my cousin to prison. We're assembling proof, I told him. Proof that whatever becomes of your father's estate, once he's gone missing, funds transferred, titles, beneficiaries that didn't belong. None of it was his intention. I pressed the envelope shut, found a black marker and wrote across the face of it to be opened only by Adele Winthorpe, estate attorney, or by court order. Keldon watched every stroke of that pen. Then quietly, "You understand what you're doing here, right? This isn't just refusing to bail him out. This is the thing that puts him away." I turned to the clock above the door. 11:47 a.m. Brixton had 5 hours and 13 minutes before his creditors came to collect in their preferred way. I held the one instrument that could pull him back from that edge, but I wasn't going to deploy it the way he'd expected, not muscle, not negotiation. The next document I intended to sign was a fraud referral to the state attorney general, and that signature would do more damage to him than anything swung in anger. I never sent it. As things turned out, I didn't have to. Doan died at 4:47 Wednesday morning, 2 days after I wrote my name across that envelope. When the oxygen machine finally went quiet in the gray early light of a November dawn, the room held only the people who had genuinely loved him. I had his right hand. Keldon held his left. Tegan stood at the foot of the bed tablet in hand steady and humane right to the last. Through the night, Doan's breathing had changed in stages from quick, shallow draws to long silences between breaths, and then to one last exhale that simply didn't turn around. The machine's rhythm stopped. The monitor went flat. What I'm about to tell you is the moment everything I thought I understood about this situation broke wide open, and what it demanded of me, I wasn't sure I could give. Before we get there, I want to ask you something. If you were standing between someone you loved and someone who shared their blood and you could only protect one, how would you choose? The room filled with the particular silence that only settles in when a life has gone out of it. Tegan checked for a pulse, then raised her eyes and said softly, "I'm so sorry. He's gone." Time of death, 4:47 a.m. Keldon's voice cracked. He knew Dad. At the end, he understood that Uncle Court had held the line. He gripped my hand yesterday and said, "Your name." I looked down at my brother's face, finally at rest after days of suffering. The yellow pallor was easing into something that almost resembled sleep. "I kept the promise, brother," I whispered. "The one from the frozen lake. I kept it." Brixton was nowhere. I tried reaching him Monday night after the 5 p.m. deadline came and went in silence. Straight to voicemail. Same thing Tuesday morning. By Tuesday night, I quit trying. Whatever he'd arranged to get through Monday's reckoning, whoever he'd gone to, whatever he'd traded, it hadn't included walking into his dying uncle's room for a final hour of presence. That was the truth I sat with in that quiet room as dawn came up. Brixton had always seen Doan as a transaction worth close to $1 million, not as a man worth a last moment of human decency. When it came down to it, family wasn't a matter of shared blood. It was a matter of who showed up at 4:47 in the morning to hold your hand on the way out. The funeral was 4 days later, at Canyon Road Chapel on the west side of Santa Fe. Brixton came in a black suit that fit him like it was made for him, his face composed into an expression of measured sorrow that would have read as genuine to anyone who hadn't spent the previous week watching him try to rob the man now lying in the casket. He wrapped his arms around elderly aunts I hadn't seen in years, accepted condolences from Doane's union brothers with damp eyes and a firm grip, and delivered a brief eulogy about Uncle Doane's toughness, his devotion to the people he loved, and the mark he left on the world. The performance would have earned a standing ovation. After the service, the mourners moved to the fellowship hall for coffee and finger sandwiches. The room carried the smell of industrial brew and perfume, and the distinct sadness of people making small talk over a grief that didn't leave room for it. Brixton found me in a corner near the coat rack. "Dad," he said, pitching his voice just loud enough for the two older women standing nearby to catch. "I know what a brutal week this has been. Let me take the estate work off your hands. I do this kind of thing every day at the office. I kept my voice even. Your uncle named me executor. I'll be carrying it out exactly as his will instructs." Brixton's smile held, but his eyes went somewhere cold. He dropped to a murmur and leaned in. "You're dragging this out when it doesn't have to be difficult. All it takes is your signature on a few transfer documents, and everybody walks away with what's coming to them. Push back any further, and everyone in this room is going to hear about what you did." "What I did," I said quietly. "Refused to help your own son when the walls were closing in. Chose a dying man's wishes over your own flesh and blood. Left me to face violent creditors on my own." His smile edged a fraction wider. "I made it through Monday, Dad, but every person here is going to learn how you turned your back on me when I needed you." Keldon materialized at my side, steady and deliberate. "Cousin," he said, his tone stripped flat. "Some people are asking about Uncle Doane's favorite hymn for the remembrance cards." Brixton's mask slipped just a blink, a flash of undisguised fury, before the grieving nephew expression snapped back into place. "Of course. Pardon me, Dad. We'll pick this up later." He peeled away to work another cluster of mourners. How do you stand in a room where people are pressing your hand in sympathy and smile back at the son who just threatened to expose you for refusing to help him steal from the man they've all come to mourn? "You holding up?" Keldon asked quietly. "He made it through Monday," I said. "I know. I've been trying to work out how. His account shows a deposit Tuesday morning, $25,000. Enough to buy himself more time. Probably not enough to clear what he owes. Where did $25,000 come from? I'm not sure yet. But Uncle Court, he isn't going to let up. You see that, right? He'll keep hammering at this estate until he gets what he came for, and he'll burn both of us down to do it." I watched Brixton across the room, chuckling softly at something an elderly cousin had said, one hand resting on her shoulder in a gesture of shared loss. Each move calibrated every word pitched for an audience. Every minute of this funeral weaponized into a scene that would cast me as the villain the moment I stopped cooperating. "The will reading is in 10 days, I said. Adele Winthorpe is handling it. Once Doane's actual intentions are on the record, Brixton won't have legal ground to stand on, and if he tries to challenge it, we unseal the envelope." I walked away from that exchange with something cold spreading through me like ice water through a pipe. Brixton didn't just want the money from Doane's estate. He wanted my name on those transfer documents so that when the fraud eventually surfaced, when the pattern of exploitation came into the light, I'd be standing beside him as a co-conspirator rather than a witness. He wasn't trying to take an inheritance. He was trying to make me an accomplice. And in 7 days, I would find out exactly how he'd survive Monday's deadline and what that survival was going to cost both of us. Those 7 days came fast. Adele Winthorpe drew the sealed will from her filing cabinet at exactly 2 p.m. on November 20th. 10 days after we put my brother in the ground and said in a voice that had carried hard news for 2 decades, "Gentlemen, what I'm about to read is going to catch at least one of you off guard." Her office occupied the 3rd floor of a brick building in the downtown Santa Fe, the kind of place that smelled of old law books and furniture polish worked into wood over many years. Adele was 57, with 2 decades of Doane Holver's legal affairs stored in those steel cabinets, and she knew every word of the authentic will before she broke the seal. Brixton sat to my left in a gray suit, his face set in an expression of patient expectation. Keldon sat to my right, hands resting flat on the conference table. Santa Fe traffic hummed 3 floors below the window. Adele opened the document and began reading in her clear, measured attorney's voice. I, Doan Randall Halver, being of sound mind and body, do hereby revoke all prior wills and codicils, and declare this to be my last will, and testament executed this 15th day of March 2022. March 2022, 18 months before Doan's cancer diagnosis. Adele continued, I name my brother Court Halver as sole executor of this estate. He alone possesses the moral spine required to carry out my wishes without compromise or corruption. Brixton went very still. My primary asset, the residential property located at Eagle Nest Lake, New Mexico, valued at approximately $850,000, shall be sold by my executor. Proceeds shall be divided equally, 50% to my son, Keldon Halver, 50% to establish the Doan Halver Trade Skills Scholarship Fund at the University of New Mexico. Adele turned the page. My life insurance policy, currently valued at $500,000, shall pass in its entirety to my son Keldon Halver. My trust accounts totaling approximately $120,000 shall be distributed as follows. Brixton shoved to his feet so hard, his chair scraped back across the floor. This is a fraud, he said, his voice climbing. Dad was supposed to inherit and pass it on to me. You manipulated him. You worked on him until he turned against his own family. Adele cut through it with steel in her tone. Mr. Brixton Halver, this will was executed in March of 2022, a full year and a half before your uncle's cancer diagnosis. I witnessed it personally, along with 2 other attorneys from this firm. If you're alleging impropriety, I suggest you retain counsel and file a formal contest. Someone got to him, Brixton said, his face gone red. Talked him into changing it. The will has not been amended since March 2022. Adele said, her voice flat and final. Your uncle was unambiguous about his intentions, Mr. Halver. Exceptionally unambiguous. My brother had looked 18 months down the road, read the shape of what was coming, and built a legal structure with my name on the foundation, trusting me to hold it once he was gone. Brixton turned to face me. You knew. You were aware the whole time what that document said, and you sat there and let me. I didn't know, I said quietly, but I'd have done the same thing either way. He held my gaze for 3 seconds, then snatched his coat off the chair and walked out. The door hit the frame hard enough to shiver the glass. Adele set the will on the table between us. There's one more item, a sealed letter addressed to you personally. Court Doan gave it to me in October, with instructions to deliver it after the will reading. She placed a manila envelope in my hands. My name was written across the front in Doan's unsteady handwriting. I didn't open it there in Adele's office. I waited until the night alone in a roadside motel parking lot off of the 84 dome light dimming November cold, working through the glass. The envelope held 3 pages in Doan's careful hand, dated October 15th, 2023, 3 weeks before he died. Lowell, it began. If you're reading this, I'm already gone. And you've just sat through Adele reading a will that probably sent our nephew through the roof. I'm sorry for the chaos, but not sorry for what I did. I kept reading. January 18th, 1973. You pulled me out of that frozen lake and breathed air back into my lungs. I've spent 50 years knowing I carried a debt I had no way to repay. You were 19 years old, and you didn't stop to think. You just went into water cold enough to kill you both. My hands were trembling by then. The paramedics told me afterward you kept up CPR for 7 minutes straight. Wouldn't stop even when they said there was nothing left to save. You brought me back, brother. You gave me another 50 years. The letter ran 2 more pages, pulling up details I'd let go. The sound the ice made when it gave way, Doan's lips gone blue, the ambulance ride where they had wrapped us both in blankets because I'd gone hypothermic from the water. Then the closing paragraph. Now, I'm asking you to go into cold water one more time. Not for me, I'll be past it, but for Keldon, for the legacy, for the proof that family can still mean something beyond what it can extract. This estate isn't money, brother. It's evidence that certain men can still be trusted with sacred things. Guard it the way you once guarded my life. Don't let them reduce it to just another transaction. That letter transformed an estate worth over $1 million into something at once more valuable and far more dangerous. A test of whether one man could still honor a promise stretched across 50 years and a frozen lake. I sat in that parking lot, holding my brother's last words until the dome light went dark and I understood with full clarity what he'd set in motion. Doan hadn't handed me assets to distribute or property to liquidate. He'd handed me his final stand, the last ground where integrity could make its case against money. And my son was already plotting his next move, because 3 months later, I would learn that Brixton had been laying a trap I never saw coming. 3 months later, the trap surfaced. I was on hold with the investment fund compliance office in Denver corporate piano music for the 4th time in 20 minutes when the woman finally came back and delivered the words that turned my blood to ice. Mr. Halver, we show a prior authorization request filed in September 2023, 2 months before the account holder's death. It was January 2024. I'd spent 3 weeks trying to access Doan's trust accounts to begin distributing the estate as the will directed. Every attempt ran into the same obstacle accounts frozen pending security review. Pam Enfield, the compliance officer who'd spent 15 years flagging suspicious account activity, knew premeditated fraud when she was looking at it. The authorization request was filed September 18, 2023. She continued her voice measured but deliberate with a digital signature matching Brixton Halver's registered profile. It claims joint executor status and requests immediate access upon the account holder's passing. September 18th. I pulled up my calendar. Doan hadn't entered hospice until the final week of October. His cancer diagnosis hadn't come until mid-October. My brother was alive and healthy in September, I said slowly. He didn't even have a cancer diagnosis until mid-October. How could someone file for post-death access 2 months before that? That's precisely why our system flagged it, Mr. Halver. Pam's tone sharpened. Someone was planning this before the account holder was even terminal. I'm obligated to refer this to our fraud investigation team. I sat there in my Albuquerque kitchen with the phone against my ear, comprehension settling over me like cold water poured down the back of my neck. My son hadn't merely tried to steal from a dying man. He had sat at a keyboard in September, while Doan was still on his feet, still building furniture in his garage, and filed paperwork to loot a corpse that didn't exist yet. This wasn't desperation. This was premeditation. File your report, I said quietly, and send me everything you have. A month later, Keldon turned up at my door carrying a thick manila folder. He looked like sleep had been a stranger for days. His hands weren't steady when he set it down on my kitchen table. I got into Brix's voicemail inbox, he said without preamble, used his old password. I know it crosses a line, but Uncle Court, you need to hear this. He took out his phone and pressed play on an audio file. Brixton's voice came through the speaker, clear and cold. The old man won't last the week, and dead men don't need a cabin worth $850,000. I've got a buyer ready cash close in 10 days. All I need is the signature. The recording was dated November 3rd, the day of the notary ambush. Keldon laid out the rest of what he'd brought across my table. Time-stamped real estate appointment logs, email chains with the California buyer bank loan, pre-approval documents, all of it dated weeks before Doan died. This is enough to bury him legally, I said. Wire fraud, elder exploitation, attempted theft. The DA could I stopped. Keldon was crying. Not the kind of grief that flows naturally from loss. The kind that comes from being torn open by a moral question you'd give anything not to have to answer. What is it? I asked. He pressed the back of his hand to his eyes. Last night, my daughter asked me if it's stealing when it's family. I went very still. Senna is 14 years old, Keldon went on, his voice fracturing. She's trying to work out whether fraud is excusable if you love the person you're taking from. She wants to know why Uncle Brixton isn't at the table anymore, why her grandfather's funeral tore the family apart, whether taking something that belongs to someone else is acceptable if the need is genuine enough. He looked up at me. If I step back now, Uncle Court, she learns the answer is yes. She learns that family is a license to take without consequence, that love is cover for exploitation. What do you say to a 14-year-old girl when she asks whether love makes theft forgivable? And the person she's asking about is her own cousin. What did you tell her? I asked quietly. I told her stealing is always wrong. Even if you love the person, even if the need is real. His hands were still unsteady. But she's watching us, Uncle Court. She's watching to find out if grown people actually stand behind what they tell children, or whether those things are just words we put away once the money gets large enough. I looked down at the evidence spread across my kitchen table, the audio file, the email chains, the digital authorization filed in September while Doan was still alive, enough to send my son to federal prison, enough to protect what Doan had trusted me to guard, enough to show a 14-year-old girl that integrity holds its shape even when the stakes get real. "We don't back down," I said. Keldon gave one nod, then moved toward the door. He stopped and turned around. "Uncle Court, there's something I need you to understand. This stopped being about my dad's estate a while ago. This is about whether my daughter comes up believing that family is a wall that blocks consequences, or whether she learns that the people who love you hardest are the ones who refuse to let you off the hook." I know. He left. Keldon walked out the door with that folder still on my kitchen table and drove back to Colorado. And I sat there with the evidence that could put my son in federal prison on wire fraud and elder exploitation charges. But the thing that held me awake that night wasn't the legal case. It was the image of a 14-year-old girl asking her father if stealing is wrong when you really need the money. If I folded now, if I let Brixton walk to protect him from what he'd earned, that girl would absorb the most corrosive lesson a family can pass down. Fraud is how we survive. And Brixton was about to prove he'd taken that lesson further than I ever could have imagined. He proved it. 3 weeks later, Brixton was waiting beside my truck in the Safeway parking lot on a Thursday afternoon in March, crying before I was close enough to make out words. The Albuquerque sun was hard and white, the asphalt shimmering in the heat. He was leaning against my passenger door, face red and wet shoulders shaking. "Dad," he said when I was 10 feet away. "Please, I'm begging you." I stopped walking. "They're not threatening anymore." He said the words spilling out between sobs. "They're promising. They've given me until the end of this month, or I end up in a hospital in pieces. Just let me put the cabin up as collateral. I'll pay it back. I swear on Mom's grave I'll pay it back." His mother, my wife, gone 14 years from breast cancer, that moved faster than the doctors could get ahead of it. He was reaching into that grave for leverage. "Your mother wouldn't want me to steal from a dead man to pull you out of a hole you dug yourself," I said quietly. The grief on his face caved into fury so quickly I barely tracked the change. "If you ever loved me, if you ever loved her, you'd put your name on one piece of paper and save your own son's life." His voice split into something halfway between a scream and a sob. "But you'd rather stand here playing the righteous man while Keldon collects $500,000 for nothing and your actual son gets his kneecaps broken. Every part of the father in me, the man who'd raised this boy alone after his mother was gone, who'd taught him to throw a curveball and read a bank statement, who'd sat in every folding chair, at every parent-teacher conference, and little league game, wanted to reach out and sign whatever kept him safe. But Doan's voice from that frozen lake in 1973 was louder. Some promises carry more weight than blood. "I'm not signing anything," I said. Brixton held my gaze for 5 seconds, then drove his boot into my truck's passenger door, hard enough to leave a dent. "You're killing me," he said. "You understand that you're picking a dead man over your living son. When they find me beaten half to death in some parking lot, I hope you think back to this moment." He walked away without turning around. I stood in that Safeway parking lot with my groceries warming in the Albuquerque sun, and I knew that whatever was still coming would be worse than everything that had come before. 2 weeks later, I was in Santa Fe sitting across from Adele in her downtown office. "This injunction means any attempt to transfer, sell, mortgage, or encumber the Eagle Nest Lake property requires a court hearing, with you present as executor," she said, sliding the document toward me. "He cannot touch it without going before a judge." I worked through the legal language. It was airtight. Every back channel Brixton had been constructing over the past 6 months, every fraudulent authorization, every forged document, every pressure tactic was now walled off behind a judicial order. "How fast can we file this?" I asked. "Today, if you're ready." I signed the authorization. My phone rang while I was still in Adele's office. Keldon calling from Colorado. "Uncle Court, my cousin, just sent me a text calling you a murderer." Keldon's voice was pulled tight with controlled anger. "He's telling everyone in the family that you're letting him die to hold on to money you don't even need." "Then let him tell them," I said. "The moment this injunction hits the record, he's going to see that every door he thought he could slip through just locked from the inside." "He's going to escalate," Keldon said. "I know." Adele filed the injunction at 3:47 p.m. on April 12th. By 6 p.m., the same evening Brixton had blocked my number and sent a mass email to the extended family with the subject line, "My father chose money over his son's life." The email was a precision instrument of manipulation. He described the gambling debts as temporary financial difficulty from a business investment gone wrong. He recast Doan's estate as family resources being hoarded by my father out of spite. He claimed I'd refused even temporary collateral use that would spare his life while keeping the property within the family. Every line was engineered to paint me as the villain. My phone started going off within the hour, cousins I hadn't spoken to in years. Doan's old union friends, people from the funeral who'd caught pieces of the story, and now wanted to know whether I was really letting my own son die over money. I stopped picking up after the sixth call. Keldon sent me screenshots of the group texts cascading through the extended family. Half of them had taken Brixton's version as fact. The other half were waiting to see what I offered in my defense. I offered nothing because anything I said would mean laying out the full picture of what Brixton had done. The fraud, the forgery, the attempted theft from a dying man, and that would make me look like I was dismantling my own son to justify my own coldness. So I held my silence and let the family land wherever they needed to. I walked out of Adele's office into cold April rain, knowing I had just set legal machinery in motion that would either preserve my brother's legacy or end my relationship with my son for good. There was no version of events where I kept both. The moment that injunction entered the court, record the moment every opening Brixton had been counting on, slammed shut with the weight of judicial authority. My son stopped being a desperate man reaching for a lifeline and turned into something considerably more dangerous, a cornered animal with nothing left to lose. And in 2 months, I would find out exactly how dangerous that made him. 2 months later, the discovery came. A phone call from an area code I didn't recognize on a Tuesday morning in June. When I answered, a woman's voice, fragile but resolved, said, "Mr. Halver, my name is Norma Kettridge, and I believe your son stole $52,000 from my husband before he died." I sat down at my kitchen table. "Mrs. Kettridge, can you tell me what happened?" Norma Kettridge was 71 years old, still carrying the weight of her husband's shame-filled final months. She'd come across Court's contact information through Doan's obituary and spent 3 weeks gathering the nerve to make the call. "My husband was too ashamed," she said, her voice steady even with the tremor working underneath it. "He never told our daughter, never filed a police report. He just got quieter and smaller until the cancer finished him. I only found the paperwork after he was gone." What she described made my blood go cold. An investment opportunity with guaranteed returns. Signature required within 48 hours. Repayment promised in 90 days. The same language, the same pressure. The same playbook Brixton had run at Doan's deathbed. $52,000, Norma continued. "Our entire retirement cushion beyond Social Security. Your son told my husband it was a sure thing that he processed these investment claims every day through his insurance work, that the window was closing fast. Mrs. Kettridge, can you walk me through the documents your husband signed?" She could. Every detail tracked the pattern I'd already seen: urgent deadlines, dense legal language crafted to confuse promises of financial security that dissolved the instant the ink dried. "If you let him walk away from this, Mr. Halver, I won't be his last victim," Norma said quietly. "My husband died believing he'd been a fool. But it wasn't foolishness. It was predation. Your son found an elderly man who trusted people in his profession, and he took everything he could carry. Every instinct I had as a father screamed to shield my son from what was coming. But Norma Kettridge's voice kept cutting through her husband dying, ashamed, emptied out by the boy I had raised to understand that integrity outlasts money. The moral weight of it had shifted completely. Letting Brixton escape consequences didn't just protect him. It financed his next victim. "Mrs. Kettridge," I said carefully, "would you be willing to document everything, dates, amounts, copies of whatever paperwork you have?" "I already have," she said. "I'll get it to you tomorrow." 2 months after that, in August, I drove out to the Eagle Nest Lake cabin to photograph the property for the court-ordered appraisal. Keldon met me there, coming up in his truck from Colorado. The cabin sat on 3 acres of pine forest with 100 feet of shoreline, and in the long light of late summer, it looked exactly the way Doan had always kept it: calm, solid, worth every dollar the appraisal would assign it. I was on the porch adjusting my camera when Brixton's car rolled into the gravel drive. He hadn't come alone. Dex Farlow climbed out of the passenger side, the same Taos real estate broker from the emails Keldon had unearthed months earlier. Mid-50s expensive suit leather portfolio that telegraphed commission hunger from 20 feet away. A second car pulled in behind them, carrying a man in his 30s, sunglasses, polo shirt. "Dad," Brixton said, walking toward me with a kind of controlled urgency he'd clearly rehearsed. "Good timing. This is Mr. Farlow, and this is the California buyer I mentioned. We need to get the purchase agreement finalized today." "There is no purchase agreement," I said quietly. "The property is under court injunction. You know that." Brixton's expression held steady. "The purchase agreement is binding. Dad, this man, has put down $50,000 in earnest money. If you refuse to sign as executor, you're exposing the estate to significant liability." The California buyer looked like he wanted to be somewhere else. Dex Farlow opened his portfolio and produced a thick sheaf of documents. "I brought this man here under false pretenses," I said, looking directly at Farlow. "There is no legitimate sale here. The court has frozen all transfers pending estate distribution." The polished mask Dex Farlow had been wearing split right down the middle. "Mr. Halver, given what seems to be a legal dispute, perhaps we ought to reschedule." That's when the sound stopped me cold. The heavy steel deadbolt on the cabin's front door, driving home with a crack like a chambered rifle round. I spun around. Brixton had his back to the door, one hand locked on the bolt. "We're not going anywhere until this gets settled," he said, measured still but trembling underneath. "Dad, put your name on that transfer authorization, or stand in front of a judge and explain why you killed a legitimate sale." Keldon was still out in his truck, nowhere close enough to hear any of it. The California buyer retreated a step, both palms raised. "Look, I want no part of sit down," Brixton said. The man sat. Dex Farlow had gone the color of old chalk. "Mr. Halver, I believe there's been a fundamental misunderstanding about what kind of transaction this is." "Nothing has been misunderstood," I said, holding my son's gaze. "You hauled these men out here to lean on me until I signed papers that fly in the face of a court order. That's coercion." Brixton's eyes carried the same thing I'd seen in that Safeway parking lot, raw desperation with something darker running beneath it. The deadbolt had clicked, and in that single mechanical sound, I felt 50 years of being his father cave inward, the crushing recognition that my own son would harm me if that's what it took. "I won't sign anything," I said. "Then you'll stand right there until your thinking changes," Brixton said quietly. I stood in that cabin with the locked door at my back, Brixton between me and the way out a stranger in a suit, watching the whole arrangement fall apart with visible dread. What became clear to me in that moment, with a precision that felt almost surgical, was that Brixton had moved past fraud. He was cornered and willing to make his desperation physical when the legal leverage ran dry. And my next move was going to force him to either retreat or cross a line he couldn't walk back from. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. Keldon shouldered through the door when the shouting reached him, and the Bonner County Sheriff arrived 11 minutes after my call. Dex Farlow handed over his business card and walked out voluntarily. The California buyer had already cleared out before the cruiser rolled to a stop. Brixton demanded an attorney and said nothing further released at the scene. No arrest, but the responding officer set down every detail in an incident report that would surface as Exhibit F 3 days later in a soundproof conference room in downtown Santa Fe. The room was joyless gray walls, fluorescent tubes bleaching every face to something unhealthy. A court recorder sat at the far end of the table, fingers resting on her stenography machine. Adele was on my right, Keldon beside her. Across the table, Brixton sat with a public defender on either side, the kind of lawyer who looked like he'd lost a coin flip to be there. "This is the last offer, Brixton," I said, sliding a document toward him. "Sign the confession laying out every fraud attempt. Pull every fraudulent authorization. Kill the real estate listing. Make full restitution to Mrs. Kettridge's estate. Take the structured plea probation and supervised restitution." I paused. "Or everything goes to the state attorney general first thing tomorrow, and you're staring down federal wire fraud charges." Brixton left the document untouched. He watched me with eyes I didn't recognize. "You chose them over me," he said, rage threading through every word. "Ghosts and strangers over your own living son. I was drowning, and you handed me a dead man's cabin and some widow's sob story. That widow's husband went to his grave disgraced because you stripped away his retirement," I said quietly. "You don't get to be the victim here, Brixton. I'm your son." His voice climbed toward a shout. "Does that count for nothing? Does blood mean less than whatever money you're protecting?" Keldon spoke then, quiet but with iron in it. "My father spent his life showing you that theft is wrong. Your uncle poured everything into building something worth keeping, and you're sitting there calling them the villains because they refuse to let you steal from them. Look at what you've become. Brixton swung toward Keldon with something past anger-hate, with all the softness burned away. Traitor. You sided with your uncle over your own blood. I sided with my daughter over protecting a criminal. Keldon didn't let him finish. Senna is watching this family. She's forming her idea of what we actually stand for when things get hard. And I won't teach her that loyalty means helping someone steal. I had raised Brixton believing that owning your wrongs and making restitution could mend almost anything. Watching him in that deposition room, choosing grievance over every principle I'd tried to give him, it was one of the longer losses of my life. Brixton got to his feet. I'm not signing that, he said. And when they come for me, when this goes to trial, I'll make sure everyone knows your version of fatherhood. How you weighed your son against money and the money won. How you left him to face violent creditors on his own. How you burned your family down to protect strangers. He crossed to the door and stopped with his hand on the frame. I hope it was worth it, Dad. I hope Doan's legacy keeps you warm because you just lost your only son. The door shut. The court recorder's fingers lifted from the keys. Adele spoke quietly. That was a confession. He admitted he owed creditors and that you refused to help him cover it with fraud. I know, I said. Keldon's hands weren't steady. Are we really going through with this? He asked, sending him to federal court. He chose that himself, I said. We put mercy on the table. He called it a betrayal. 3 weeks on, Keldon carried a thick manila envelope through the doors of the New Mexico State Court Registry. I walked in beside him. Inside, audio from the Hospice confrontation, digital records tracing the September fraud authorization, real estate conspiracy timelines covering Brixton's 3-week marketing campaign, and sworn affidavits from Norma Kettridge and Boyd Culver, the notary. The woman behind the counter was in her 50s with the flat, weathered eyes of someone who'd processed more family wreckage than any person should have to. Mr. Halver, she said to Keldon, you understand that filing these materials opens a formal criminal investigation of your cousin. Once I stamp these, there's no informal way out. Are you certain? Keldon set the envelope down. I have a daughter asking whether it's okay to steal if you love the person you're stealing from, he said, voice steady. If I walk away to cover for my cousin, I've answered that for her. I'm certain. She opened the envelope and worked through the contents methodically. Her face didn't shift, reading Norma Kettridge's affidavit, but her hands slowed when she reached the audio transcript. This is comprehensive, she said. Wire fraud across state lines, elder exploitation, attempted theft of estate assets. The DA will want this. She reached for her official stamp, a heavy metal thing that looked as though it had been doing this job since New Mexico earned its statehood. Last chance, she said to Keldon. Once it's in the system, it's in the system. Do it, Keldon said. The stamp came down with a sound like a door slamming shut forever, and I understood that certain fractures in a family don't heal. You only learn to carry them. She marked the case number in red ink across the file cover, logged it, and handed Keldon a receipt. Expect contact from the investigator within 48 hours, she said. You'll likely be called as a witness. Understood, Keldon said. We stepped out into bright September sunlight, aware we had just set loose something that would run entirely on its own. The instant those files entered the state database, Brixton stopped being my son with a problem and became a defendant in a criminal fraud case with my nephew as the primary witness. No quiet resolution remained. No family gathering could make any of it disappear. No way to pull any of this back. In the parking lot, I turned to Keldon. Your father would be proud of you, I said. Not for bringing Brixton down, for keeping Senna from inheriting a poisoned idea of what family means. Keldon nodded, but his eyes were wet. I just testified against my own cousin, he said, barely above a whisper. Half this family will never speak to me again. I know, I said. But your daughter will grow up understanding that doing right matters more than doing easy. That's worth more than holiday tables full of people who'd call fraud acceptable if they loved the one doing it. And in 6 weeks, a courtroom would show us whether we'd acted with courage or simply blown our family apart for nothing. 6 weeks proved it. The hearing room smelled of floor wax and fear, mostly mine. It was October, and the state administrative hearing was held in a windowless room on the second floor of a Santa Fe government building. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The vinyl chairs were hard and cold. A hearing officer, a woman in her 50s, steel-gray hair, the kind of no-nonsense expression you earn after decades of adjudicating fraud, presided from a raised desk at the front of the room. Keldon sat beside the state investigator at the prosecution table, a thick evidence folder laid open in front of him. Brixton sat across the aisle next to a harried public defender in his 30s, who had the look of a man handed the case file that same morning and hadn't made it past the first page. Adele Winthorpe testified first, walking through the November hospice confrontation in methodical detail, the notary who arrived too early, the layered documents engineered to obscure fraud, the speakerphone call to Keldon that dismantled Brixton's fabricated claims. Norma Kettridge appeared briefly via video link to authenticate the financial records from her husband's fraud case. Her voice stayed level as she identified the documents Brixton had used to drain their retirement savings. Then Keldon laid out the evidence archive. Every forged signature, every falsified authorization filed in September while Doan was still in good health. Every email thread with Dex Farlow about listing a property Brixton had no right to sell. Every text message threatening violence when debts weren't settled by Monday deadlines. The paper trail was thorough and crushing. Brixton's public defender attempted a defense built around incompetence, the theory that his client had simply misunderstood the complexities of estate law and blundered rather than schemed. The hearing officer shut it down. Counsel, the evidence shows your client filed a digital authorization 2 months before the account holder's terminal diagnosis. He marketed a property for sale 3 weeks before the owner entered hospice. This isn't confusion. This is premeditation. I watched my son's face as the evidence stacked up against him. He fought to hold himself together, but the cracks were showing the tremor in his hands when he reached for water, the way his voice splintered when he tried to answer questions. The bureaucratic machinery he'd tried to bend to his will was now running him through with the same impersonal efficiency. The hearing officer's ruling came 2 weeks later, sufficient evidence of elder fraud, wire fraud, and attempted theft to warrant formal criminal prosecution. I thought I'd feel vindicated. Instead, what settled over me was just exhaustion. In November, Keldon asked me to come to his attorney's office in Santa Fe. "There's something you need to see," he said. "Something Dad set up that I didn't fully understand until now." He produced a document I'd laid eyes on before, but never read with any care, a codicil to Rowena's trust, dated 8 years ago. Court Halver. I read shall serve as interim trustee and guardian of the estate established herein, with full fiduciary authority to preserve and protect said assets until such time as the primary beneficiary reaches age 25 years. I stopped reading. Keldon, who's the primary beneficiary? He looked at me steadily. Keep reading. I found it 3 paragraphs down. Primary beneficiary. Senna Halver, granddaughter of the trustee, to inherit full estate assets upon reaching age 25 years or upon completion of post-secondary education, whichever occurs later. My hands began to shake. "Senna, your granddaughter?" Keldon said quietly. "My daughter. She's 14 years old, Uncle Court, and she's the actual beneficiary of everything you've been protecting. You were never fighting for yourself. You've been a bridge guarding her inheritance from her own father." I sat there holding that document while the full weight of it finally broke through. Rowena had arranged this 8 years ago, right after Brixton's first serious gambling losses. She'd watched the pattern take shape and constructed a generational firewall, trusting me to stand between Senna's future and the predation she knew was coming. The whole fight had never been about personal inheritance. It had been about keeping a 14-year-old girl from growing up knowing her father had tried to steal what was hers. "Does she know?" I asked. "She knows her great-grandmother left her a trust. She doesn't know the full scope of what you've been fighting to protect." I thought about Senna asking her father whether stealing was acceptable if it was for family, about Keldon refusing to bury evidence because of what it would teach his daughter. The battle had never been father against son. It had been grandfather shielding granddaughter from the wreckage left by the generation between them. December 12th, 2024, sentencing. The district court judge was in his 60s, his face carrying the weathered look of someone who'd spent a career watching families tear themselves apart over money. Brixton stood before the bench hollow-eyed, refusing to meet my gaze. "Mr. Halver," the judge said, "you systematically attempted to defraud your dying uncle's estate through forgery, manipulation, and coercion. You targeted vulnerable elderly victims for financial exploitation. The present tense report indicates a pattern of predatory behavior extending beyond your own family." He paused. However, the state has recommended a plea agreement given your lack of prior felony convictions. The court accepts that recommendation. 3 years probation, 200 hours of community service, full restitution of $47,000 in legal costs and attempted fraudulent transfers. The betrayal of trust inherent in family fraud, the judge continued, carries particular moral weight. You turned familial bonds into instruments of exploitation against people who had every right to rely on you. This court hopes you use your probation period to reckon with that. Brixton said nothing. I watched my son receive formal justice and felt no triumph, only a deep settling sadness. The hardest part wasn't the battle. It wasn't even winning. The hardest part was recognizing that righteous anger had been the engine driving me for months, and now that it had nowhere left to go, I wasn't sure who I was meant to be. I walked out of that courthouse into the bite of cold December air. Keldon was waiting on the steps. "It's done," he said. "I know. You protected her Uncle Court. Senna gets to grow up with an inheritance her great-grandmother built and her grandfather guarded. That matters." I stepped off the courthouse steps, the December cold cutting through my coat, and understood that the hardest part wasn't winning. It was learning to live without the hatred that had kept me upright. Keldon's office carried the smell of fresh paper, and possibility the first planning meeting that wasn't about defending something. I'd spent 3 days since the sentencing, trying to loosen the knot in my chest, the one that had drawn tighter every single morning for 14 months. The courthouse steps had been cold beneath my shoes that December afternoon, and something unsettling had come clear. I'd grown so practiced at fighting that I'd lost the instinct for building. Keldon sat across from me now, desk cleared down to a single manila folder. The winter light through his window was pale and clean. "I've asked someone to join us," he said. "Senna's situation requires specialized structures." The door opened and a woman in her mid-40s came in, with the precise measured movements of someone who counted every step twice. She wore reading glasses on a beaded chain and carried a leather portfolio embossed with gold initials. "This is Eileen Radner," Keldon said, trust officer at Pacific Northwest Fiduciary. She specializes in guardianship frameworks for minor beneficiaries. Eileen extended her hand. Her grip was firm, her nails trimmed short. "Mr. Halver, I've reviewed the estate documentation. What you're protecting is significant not just financially." She opened her portfolio and drew out a document that bore the marks of multiple revisions. The page edges were clean, the text dense with legal precision. "Your wife started this," Eileen said quietly. I stared at her. "What?" "Rowena contacted our firm 2 years ago. She outlined a contingency framework for Senna's care in the event that Doan's health declined, and you needed to step in as temporary guardian." Eileen slid the document toward me. She never finalized it, but the architecture is sound. We're completing what she began. My throat tightened. Rowena had planned for this. Even while I'd been blind to Brixton's schemes, she'd been laying the scaffolding. I was just hanging the walls. Keldon's voice was gentle. She wanted ironclad protections, no single point of failure. Eileen clicked her pen and pulled out a fresh yellow notepad. "Here's what I'm proposing. A transparent guardianship framework with 3 key components. First, dual signature verification on all expenditures over $500. You and I both approve independently. Second, quarterly audits conducted by an independent CPA, with copies sent to both Senna and the court. Third, annual reports to a court-appointed guardian ad litem until Senna reaches majority." She wrote as she spoke, her handwriting small and meticulous. "The goal," Eileen continued, "is to make the system so transparent that no one, including you, can make unilateral decisions about Senna's assets. Every dollar is tracked, every choice is documented." "What about educational expenses?" "Medical pre-approved categories monthly caps," Eileen said. "Anything exceeding the cap triggers the dual signature requirement. Senna herself receives quarterly statements starting at age 16, full access to all records at 18, and complete control at 25. She turned to a new page and began sketching a flowchart, boxes and arrows taking shape. "The trust language would read something like this," she said, then recited from memory. "The guardian shall maintain fiduciary responsibility for all trust assets designated for the benefit of Senna Halver, the beneficiary, until such time as the beneficiary attains the age of majority as defined by Washington state law. All disbursements exceeding $500 shall require written authorization from both the guardian and the designated trust officer." Quarterly financial statements shall be prepared by an independent certified public accountant and distributed to the beneficiary, the guardian, the trust officer, and the court-appointed guardian ad litem. The guardian acknowledges that transparency and accountability are the paramount objectives of this framework. Those words settled over the room like something binding and permanent. Keldon gave a slow nod. It's bulletproof. It's also exactly what Rowena wanted, Eileen said. She put it in her notes, Court will try to handle everything himself. Structure it so he can't. A laugh came out of me, short and rough, half grief and half recognition. She'd read me better than I'd ever read myself. We pushed through another hour: investment approaches, college fund projections, emergency protocols. Eileen's questions never let up, her pen covering page after page. By the time we finished, pale winter light had faded to late afternoon gray. Christmas decorations lined the streets. I drove home through the colored bulbs bleeding soft in the drizzle. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with a blank sheet and wrote, "Brixton, you stole from your dying father. You deceived a widow. You tried to reach into a 14-year-old's inheritance and take what wasn't yours. For 14 months, I carried a hatred so precise it felt almost sacred. But hatred is a weight, and at 63 I'm out of whatever it takes to keep hauling it. Whether you feel remorse, I genuinely don't know. Whether you grasp what you shattered not just legally, but the invisible architecture of trust that once held this family, I can't say. Maybe you'll serve your 3 years and emerge different. Maybe you'll just emerge more careful. Here's what I'm certain of." "What?" "I'm finished serving as your enemy. I'm finished letting your choices set the terms of my days. You made your bed. I hope one day you can rest in it. But if you ever decide to speak real truth, not the version your lawyer scripted, I'll listen. Court." I read it twice, chest heavy, with everything those words couldn't contain. Then I walked it to the shredder. The teeth pulled the page apart in seconds, the sound sharp and done. I watched the strips drop into the bin and felt something release that I hadn't known I was still gripping. From the drawer I pulled a fresh index card and wrote, "The moment you're ready to tell truth without a script, I'll be here to listen." Envelope county jail address left by the door for morning mail. Next morning, a handwritten card was waiting in my mailbox instead. Return address local Senna's foster placement. The lettering was round and deliberate. "Grandpa, I heard what you did. Can we talk?" The senior center carried the smell of burnt coffee and arthritis cream. 50 faces there to hear how I'd nearly lost everything. I'd phoned Senna the morning after her card arrived, told her we'd sit down after the holidays once things quieted. Her voice on the line had been steady, curious, no accusation in it. That talk could keep. This room couldn't. Keldon stood at the front beside the folding table checking the microphone. The coffee urn hissed in the corner. Someone coughed. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, flattening the room in institutional beige. "Thank you for being here," I said, projecting toward the back. "My name is Court Hulver. 14 months ago, my nephew attempted to defraud my dying brother's estate. He came very close." The room went quiet. I walked them through what it actually felt like from the inside, not the legal mechanics, but the emotional terrain. How grief strips your defenses to the studs. How loneliness swings open doors you'd normally keep bolted. How someone close to you can manufacture urgency and route it around every rational defense you've built over a lifetime. They use the clock as a weapon. Keldon said, his tone deliberate. "Sign today or lose the opportunity. Act now or the offer expires. Decide this minute or miss your chance." Urgency is the con artist's sharpest tool. I described the pressure tactics documents fanned out in thick stacks. Pages turned before your eyes could settle, the smooth reassurance that everything is standard, that everyone does it this way, that the only question is whether you trust them. The answer, I said, is always no. Any document worth signing can wait a full 24 hours. A woman in the third row put up her hand. Late 70s, slight cardigan misbuttoned fingers working restlessly against the armrest. "What if they tell you you'll lose the house?" Her voice caught. "What if they say it has to be signed today?" "Then you've just been handed your red flag," Keldon said quietly. "Legitimate transactions don't carry a countdown." The applause at the end was subdued, the sound of people recognizing their own vulnerability, not celebrating anything. The room emptied slowly. Some stopped to shake Keldon's hand. Others took the resource sheets from the table. The woman from the third row found me while I was gathering the handouts. Up close, I could see the worry carved around her eyes, her bag strap biting into her shoulder. "My daughter's coming this afternoon," she said under her breath. She's bringing a notary. She says I need to sign something about the house tax benefits protecting my equity. She says if I don't do it today, I'll lose everything. My stomach dropped straight down. "What's your name?" I asked. "Hester Odom." The hand she placed on my arm was cold as glass despite the heat in that room. "What do I do?" Keldon stepped closer, his face sharpening with recognition. "You say no," I told her. "You tell her that any legitimate document holds for 24 hours. You ask for copies to go over with an independent advisor, someone with zero financial interest in your decision." "But she's my daughter," Hester said, and the weight of a lifetime pressed behind those words, trust curdling into confusion. "Which is exactly why caution matters here," Keldon said softly. "Family closeness is family leverage." We gave Hester 3 numbers, an elder law attorney, a financial advisor, offering free consultations, and my cell. She folded the slip into her purse with shaking hands. "If they push you," I said, "that's your signal. Urgency is their weapon. Time is yours." Her eyes went wet. She nodded and left. Can stolen years be converted into someone else's armor? I drove home through the December rain with that question turning in my mind. 14 months of fighting Brixton had taught me the internal mechanics of manipulation. The pressure points, the emotional triggers, the engineered false urgency designed to outrun clear thinking. Those months weren't coming back, but maybe I could make them useful beyond my own survival. That night at the kitchen table, I opened a yellow notepad and wrote out everything those months had taught me, distilling 14 months of hell into something a person could actually use. The pages filled fast, notes, patterns, cautions too dense and scattered. I crossed out half and started fresh. What might have changed things for Doan? What would give Hester a fighting chance? What could someone hold on to when pressure was wearing the face of love and urgency felt like necessity? 3 rules. That's the most anyone can carry when the ground is shifting. I wrote them plain. 1, wait 24 hours before signing anything, no exceptions. A document that won't keep overnight was never legitimate. 2, photograph every page, front and back, and get copies to someone you trust before you sign. 3, bring in an independent party with zero financial stake, not family, not friends of family, someone entirely outside the situation. I stared at those lines, feeling everything they had cost to learn. Isolation is what predators depend on. I'd watched it take Doan. I'd seen it in Norma Kettridge's case, in every story Keldon had laid out. When people feel cut off, when they sense the clock running out, when the one telling them to hurry is someone they love, that's when ruinous decisions get made. Never let them dictate your ink. I folded the paper into my wallet. 3 days later, the phone rang at breakfast. Hester Odom's voice was firmer, steadier than I remembered. "I stopped the signing," she said. "I told my daughter I needed 24 hours. She got angry, said I was being stubborn, that I didn't trust her. I photographed the documents anyway. Then I called the attorney you gave me. I set down my coffee. Those papers would have transferred her home to her daughter for $60,000. The house is worth $420,000. Her voice broke not from weakness, from rage. She had the notary standing by. "If you hadn't come to that senior center, if I hadn't heard what happened to you, I would have signed." My throat went tight. "I'm glad you didn't." "Your 3 rules save me," Hester said. I wrote them down. They're going on my refrigerator. When I hung up, I sat looking at the notepad where I'd written those rules out again for myself. The words blurred. I had been powerless to protect my son from his own choices. That failure was total. I'd watched him become someone I no longer recognized, someone who could rob a dying father without flinching. But I could protect a stranger from their signature. That was the inheritance Rowena actually left me. Not the money, not the property, not even the trust structure she'd set in motion for Senna. She'd handed me the chance to take our family's wreckage and rebuild it into something that shielded people whose names I'd never know. I picked up the pen and added a 4th line beneath the 3 rules. Share this. Someone you know needs it. A thin layer of snow had settled across the hospice parking lot, the same December, quiet as a year before. The difference was why I'd come. Hester Odom's call had unlocked something the worst chapter of my life might hand someone else a lifeline. That inheritance wasn't mine to pocket. It was meant to circulate. The drive from Albuquerque to Santa Fe had been brutal. Interstate 25 gone pale and treacherous, the sky the color of dirty wool. Pulling up to the building, I was struck by how modest it appeared. Brick and glass, nothing dramatic. Just a 3-story structure throwing cloud reflections back at the sky. 14 months ago, Rowena had drawn her last breath somewhere on that top floor. And somewhere in this lot, everything I'd believed about Brixton had quietly collapsed alongside her. I found a spot near the entrance and shut off the engine. 2 rows over a car door swung open hard. A man somewhere in his 50s, thick through the shoulders, had planted himself at the window of a sedan bearing down on the driver. The driver was elderly gray-haired head, bowed, shaking it slowly. The younger man's palm came down on the roof, not a blow more, a period at the end of a sentence he had already decided. That stance, that choreography. I'd watched it reconstructed in depositions, cataloged in witness accounts, traced backward through Brixton's trail. Need converted into leverage. Care as a mask over demand. The old man's resistance dissolved, his shoulders dropped. The younger man stood up straight with the ease of someone who'd gotten what he came for, then moved toward the entrance without looking back. I didn't move. I just watched the old man sit there alone, hands loose on the wheel, going nowhere. This is what the parking lots of hospices are. Feeding grounds. People show up here emptied out by loss, and certain kinds of people have always known where the emptied out go. I couldn't dismantle that system, but I could leave something behind, a trail of breadcrumbs for anyone trying to fight their way back. Before leaving Albuquerque, I'd made a stack of cards. Plain white index cards, nothing fancy, carrying the 3 rules. I'd walked Hester Odom through the same principles Keldon had helped me distill from 14 months of hard-won experience. My number printed at the bottom. 5 words under it. If you need to talk, call. I got out. Snow packed down under my boots with each step. Pine resin and diesel from the shuttle van idling at the curb. My breath fogged in the cold. The lobby hit me with forced heat and the steady buzz of fluorescent lighting. A Christmas tree in the corner, looking like it had been decorated by someone going through the motions. Antiseptic underneath cafeteria coffee on top. The woman at the front desk looked up, offered a professional smile, returned to her screen. I bypassed the sign-in sheet I had no patience to visit. I moved past the elevator bank toward the family resource area, and the metal bulletin board covered in layers of paper. There, grief support, hours, funeral parlor ads, flyers for bereavement circles. The whole paper architecture of loss. A year ago, I had stood in this same spot, desperate, defensive. Cut off Rowena's death certificate folded in my breast pocket, Brixton's voice threading through my ear. Just let me take care of this sign where I'm pointing. You're in no shape to handle details. Trust me. Now I stood here connected to Hester Odom, to Norma Kettridge, to the faceless parade of people who would occupy this spot after me, their grief making them exactly as exposed as I had been. Back then, I'd been so sure family equaled safety. So certain that Brixton's urgency was devotion, rather than a hand reaching into my pocket. What it had done to me wasn't hardened me. It had scraped out the blind spots. I stood there with my cards taking in flyers I'd almost certainly stared at a year ago, and completely failed to absorb. Somewhere down the corridor, a water fountain plinked. The Christmas tree cycled through its lights, red, green, gold, white, patient, and indifferent. How many people walk through this parking lot on any given day? Grief having shaved them down to nothing, unable to push out the single syllable that might protect them. How many households fracture right here in these hallways because someone in a hurry passes off coercion as kindness? How many pens touch paper in back seats in hushed rooms, on upper floors in the ragged space between a diagnosis and a final breath, when clear thought is a luxury nobody can afford? The one word that could break the whole pattern open is no. Grief, though, makes that the most unreachable word in existence. I worked a pushpin loose from the board and held one card up. My writing was small and careful, each letter placed like it mattered. The rules, the number, the door left open. I wasn't deluding myself that the right person would necessarily find it. But Hester had needed a single conversation, one story laid out plainly, one set of principles to hold on to. Maybe the next person needed nothing more than a card. I set the pin through the top corner and pressed it into the board tucked between a bereavement schedule and a funeral home advertisement. It hung there, quiet, asking nothing. 3 lines that might do something for a stranger I'd never crossed paths with. The remaining cards I arranged in a tidy pile on the resource table underneath, anchored by an abandoned coffee mug. The receptionist glanced my way. "Can I help you with something?" "No," I said. "I'm good." Through the lobby again, past that hollow Christmas tree, and back out into the gray. The snow had thickened small flakes coming down through flat afternoon light. My truck was where I'd left it. The sedan I'd been watching was gone, the old man with it, destination unknown. I stood there in the lot, cold threading through my coat, eyes lifted to the third-floor windows. Rowena had died behind one of those panes of glass. My sense of what family was supposed to mean had died right here on this asphalt, but something had taken root in the same ground. The understanding that protection has no chromosome. It's built from limits, not bloodlines. Loyalty was never about covering for people who used you. It was about standing between strangers and the people who'd learned to feed on their worst moments. For 14 months, I'd been circling the question of whether I could forgive Brixton, whether some path existed back to seeing him as a nephew, rather than the man who'd moved on his dying father's estate. But the snow and the silence sorted something out for me. That wasn't even the right question. Forgiving Brixton wasn't the thing. What I had to reckon with was whether I could forgive myself for years of treating blood as a higher law than principle, for excusing what shouldn't have been excused because he was kin for a blindness that had very nearly cost Doan everything. No verdict yet, but I had 3 rules pinned to a board, and I had Hester Odom's voice in my memory saying, "You saved me," and the chance that the rubble of all this could be built into something useful. Perhaps that had to be sufficient. The brass keys to the Eagle Nest Lake cabin felt denser than their weight warranted. Or perhaps that was accountability finding its settled form. The question had ridden with me north from Santa Fe. Could I grant myself absolution for putting blood above every other obligation? Somewhere along New Mexico's winter roads, closing in on the frozen lakeshore, an answer began to take shape. Perhaps forgiveness was beside the point. Perhaps what I'd earned was wisdom, and that would have to do. The cabin greeted me with cedar and cold when I got the door open. Keldon was already inside, arranging folding chairs around the wooden table. Beyond the glass, Eagle Nest Lake lay white and motionless under a pewter December sky. Senna arrived 20 minutes later, brought by her foster care coordinator. 14 years old, but the way she held herself belonged to someone older. Rowena's posture, Rowena's habit of reading a room carefully before committing to it. Dark hair tied back. A winter coat that swamped her narrow frame. Eyes carrying things no child's eyes should have to carry. "Hi, Grandpa," she said, her voice low. I pulled her close and felt how slight she was inside all that coat, the weight she'd been managing on her own. "Thank you for coming," I told her. Keldon had organized the paperwork in ordered stacks, each page flagged with colored tabs. Eileen Radner had handled the preparation remotely, her exacting handwriting visible in the margins, marking every signature line and witness notation. "These keys aren't just for the cabin," Keldon said, turning the brass ring in his hand. "They represent the framework we built. No secrets, no exceptions." The 3 of us settled at the table. Winter light came through the windows in pale sheets. Keldon took us through each document, the trust governance structure, the quarterly audit schedule, the dual signature requirements, the guardian appointments. The whole architecture was designed around a single purpose, making sure no one person could ever hold unchecked authority again. Senna followed every word with a quality of attention that would have put most grown adults to shame. "I have a question," she said when Keldon stopped. He nodded. "Of course. Did you think I didn't know?" Her eyes were on me, steady and direct. "About what Dad tried to do." Something tightened behind my sternum. Grandma told me," Senna said, quiet, certain. "Months before she died, she said Dad had a way of making bad choices when things got desperate. She said if something ever happened to Grandpa Doan, I should put my trust in you, that you'd keep what needed keeping safe even when it cost you." I looked at her and felt the ground shifts. Everything I'd thought I was protecting her from had already been handed to her gently by Rowena. "You knew?" I said. I knew enough. Not a tremor in her voice. "Grandma said you were the only one who'd pick what was right over what was easy. She wasn't wrong." Keldon cleared his throat quietly. "Then you see why none of this is optional. Not because we lack trust in each other, but because trust that has no guardrails is nothing more than wishful thinking." Senna nodded. "The finest inheritance isn't measured in what you leave behind. It lives in the honesty you weave into how things get handed forward." I heard Rowena in the careful architecture of wisdom, offered without a lecture attached. We moved through the documents one at a time, Keldon and I each standing witness to the other's signature. Senna adding hers wherever the pages called for it. The brass keys rested at the center of the table like ballast. When the last page was done, Keldon passed them to Senna. "These belong to you," he said. "We're the trustees until you're ready to carry it yourself." She took them the way you handle something that could shatter. "Thank you," she whispered. If someone tells you a decision can't wait until morning, that's not urgency talking. That's manipulation dressed in urgency's clothing. Real care gives you room to breathe. Real love never demands ink on a deadline. The people who want what's best for you will say sleep on it, turn it over, get an outside opinion. The ones who want what's yours will insist the window is closing right now. I made the drive back to Albuquerque on December 30th, the paperwork filed and the framework sealed. Senna had gripped me hard before climbing back into her foster care coordinator's car, murmuring, "I'm glad Grandma chose you." New Year's Eve came in quietly without fanfare. I spent the afternoon sorting through files, packing away documents I no longer had use for, clearing ground for whatever was coming next. The house felt altered lighter, or perhaps just less weighted by old ghosts. At dusk, I went out to check the mail. Sitting on top of the usual holiday circulars and year-end charity appeals was an envelope. Brixton's handwriting, I knew it the moment I saw it. That same tilted script that had signed off on fraudulent forms, faked authorizations, and laid down the paper record of his own unraveling. My name on the front, no return address. The postmark read, County Jail. I brought it inside and set it on the kitchen counter. Commissary paper, standard issue, faintly rough against my fingertips. I could unseal it. I could read through whatever explanation or appeal or fresh angle he'd put together. 12 months ago, I would have torn into it without a second thought, starved for any flicker of remorse, any trace of the nephew I'd known still alive somewhere under all the fraud. Now, I understood the envelope had nowhere to be. If it mattered today, it would still matter next week. If it was sincere time, wouldn't hollow that out. If it was another playtime, would make that clear too. I brewed coffee and stood at the kitchen window, watching the sky go dark. Albuquerque's amateur fireworks started, early illegal bottle rockets tracing arcs over the rooftops. Distant pops rolling through the neighborhood. 11:47 p.m. December 31st, 2024. 13 minutes left before a new year I had very nearly not lived to reach. The envelope sat on the counter at my back, sealed and patient. I entertained the thought of opening it, felt the familiar pull of that compulsion, the need to know what Brixton was, after now, what narrative he'd built around himself, which version of the story had cast him as the wrong party. Then, I thought about Hester Odom, choosing to wait a full day before acting, about Senna holding those brass keys with Rowena's wisdom already living inside her, about 3 lines pinned to a hospice bulletin board that might reach somebody I'd never lay eyes on. A person who genuinely has your interests at heart will tell you to sleep on it. A person who wants what you're holding will never give you that luxury. I left the envelope where it was and turned back to the window. The fireworks were multiplying now, the neighborhood buzzing with early celebration. Somewhere close, a car alarm triggered. Dogs answered it. Music thumped from a house several streets away. A year ago, Brixton's manufactured urgency ran my life, every emergency, every hard deadline, every warning that if it didn't happen right now, it would be gone forever. He'd turned my grief into a tool, my loyalty into a lever, my conviction that family meant unconditional trust into the very thing that nearly cost Doan everything. If you've stayed with me this far, you already know this wasn't a simple story about money or property. It was about what a family can do to itself when desperation meets silence, and what one person standing firm can change. Looking back, I count the cost plainly. I lost a nephew. I lost the version of family I'd spent decades believing in. I nearly lost myself in the grief of it. But what I found on the other side was something I didn't expect, the clarity I believe God placed in the path of all that wreckage, because Rowena had already been building the road before any of us knew we'd need it. The weight of these father stories doesn't lift easily, but carrying it honestly is the only way through. Here is what I'd want you to hold on to from all of this. If someone tells you a decision cannot wait until morning, that is not urgency. That is pressure wearing urgency's face. Walk away. When grief has hollowed you out, slow down before you sign anything. The people who love you will give you time. Blood is not a shield. Loyalty belongs to whoever tells you the truth, not whoever shares your name. And if you ever find yourself wondering whether staying quiet and gathering your proof is the right call in stories like this one, in real dad's revenge situations where the predator is counting on your hesitation, the answer is yes. Document everything. Move carefully. Let the truth do the work. If this story reached you today, I hope you'll share it with someone who needs to hear it. A parent, a sibling, anyone navigating family and money and trust at the same time. Leave a comment and tell me what stayed with you. And if you haven't subscribed to His Hidden Revenge, yet this is a good moment to do it. These are the stories that don't get told often enough. Thank you for listening all the way through. Take care of yourselves and of each other.